The Winchester rifle leveled at her chest didn't shake. Neither did Seraphine Vale's stare. Around her, 7 armed men formed a tight circle in the ranch yard, their leader demanding she surrender what she'd stolen, documents that could destroy every corrupt land grab operation across 3 territories. Behind her stood Cade Mercer's ranch hands, outnumbered but refusing to back down. One wrong word, and the frontier dust would run red. Seraphine had ridden into this ranch a week ago, answering an impossible challenge. Now she stood in its center, deciding whether to run again or finally make her stand. If you want to see how this gamble ends, stay with me until the final word. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The first thing wrong about the woman was that she showed up at all. Cade Mercer had posted his challenge 6 months back, nailed to the door of every saloon and general store within 100 miles. The wording was blunt enough to offend half the territory. Wanted. A wife strong enough to build a ranch instead of just living on one. If you can't ride through a storm, rope a steer, or work sunup to sundown without complaint, don't waste my time or yours. Most folks figured he'd written it drunk. Others called it the desperate act of a man who'd been alone too long. A few women had shown interest initially, until they'd actually visited the Mercer Ranch and seen what the challenge really meant. Endless work. Brutal conditions, miles from the nearest town. A crew of hard-bitten ranch hands who didn't bother hiding their skepticism about any woman trying to survive out here. None had lasted more than a day. So when the dust cloud appeared on the eastern road that September afternoon, rolling toward the ranch like a warning, nobody expected it to be another candidate. Cade was in the corral, working a stubborn colt, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the autumn chill creeping into the air. His foreman, a gray-bearded man named Dutch, spotted the rider first. "Someone's coming," Dutch called from the fence rail. "Moving fast." Cade didn't look up. "If it's Thompson again about those boundary markers, tell him I already gave my answer." "Don't think it's Thompson." Something in Dutch's tone made Cade pause. He turned, squinting into the low sun, and watched the dust cloud resolve into a single horse and rider. The rider sat tall in the saddle, moving with the kind of easy confidence that spoke to years in the saddle, not weeks. As they drew closer, Cade could make out more details. Dark hair tied back, simple traveling clothes, a bedroll and saddlebags that looked worn from real use, not decoration. And then the rider cleared the final stretch of road, and Cade realized 2 things simultaneously. First, it was a woman. Second, she rode like she'd been born doing it. The horse, a rangy chestnut mare, barely broke stride as they approached the ranch yard. The woman didn't pull up timidly at the gate or call out a nervous greeting. She rode straight through into the yard itself, scanning the buildings and corrals with sharp, assessing eyes, before finally bringing the mare to a smooth stop about 15 feet from where Cade stood. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The ranch hands who'd been working nearby had all stopped what they were doing, drawn by the unexpected arrival. Cade counted 6 of them gathering along the fence and near the barn, all watching with varying degrees of curiosity and doubt. The woman looked down at Cade from the saddle. She had a narrow face with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed darker than the shadows under the barn eaves. There was something unsettling about her stillness, like a hawk perched on a fence post, calm but ready to strike. "You Mercer?" she asked. Her voice carried clearly across the yard without being loud. "That's right." "You still looking for a wife?" Someone behind Cade snorted. He heard one of the younger hands mutter something, then Dutch's sharp elbow and a grunt of pain. Cade studied the woman more carefully. She couldn't have been much past 25, if that. Too young to have the kind of worn-down look some frontier women carried, but old enough that the set of her jaw suggested she'd already learned most of life's harder lessons. "Depends on who's asking," Cade said. "Seraphine Vale." She didn't offer any other information. No mention of where she'd come from, who her people were, or why a woman with her obvious skill was answering a marriage challenge instead of running her own spread somewhere. The silence stretched thin. Cade became aware of his crew watching, waiting to see how he'd handle this. Half of them probably expected him to send her away immediately. The other half were likely betting on how quickly she'd leave on her own once she saw what the work actually entailed. "You read the whole notice?" Cade asked. "The part about hard work and harder conditions?" "I read it. And you think you can handle what this ranch requires?" Seraphine's expression didn't change. but something flickered in her eyes. Amusement, maybe, or irritation. I wouldn't have wasted 3 days riding here if I didn't. Another snort from the crew. This time Dutch didn't bother stopping it. Cade felt the weight of expectation pressing down on him. He'd posted that challenge in a moment of frustration, tired of running the ranch alone, tired of women who wanted a husband but couldn't stomach the life that came with him. He'd written it to scare off anyone who wasn't serious. But now someone had actually shown up, and she was standing in his yard waiting for an answer, and every man watching knew that if he backed down now, he'd never hear the end of it. "All right," Cade said slowly. "You want to prove you belong here? You'll get your chance. But I'm not taking anyone's word about what they can handle. You've got until sunset to show me you're not wasting my time." "What's the test?" Cade nodded toward the far corral. "See that black gelding?" Everyone's attention shifted. In the corral at the edge of the property stood a horse that had become something of a legend on the ranch. A massive black animal with a wild eye and a temperament to match. They'd acquired him in a trade 6 months back, and in all that time not one person had managed to break him properly. He tolerated a halter if you were patient and careful. He'd accept grain from your hand if he was in the mood. But saddle and rider? The horse wanted no part of it. 3 ranch hands had tried. All 3 had ended up in the dirt within seconds, lucky to escape with nothing worse than bruised pride and sore ribs. "That horse," Cade said, "needs breaking. You get him saddled and ride him long enough to prove control. Not just staying on, but actual control. And we'll talk about you staying. You can't manage it. You're gone before dinner." He watched Seraphine's face as he spoke, expecting doubt or fear to crack that calm exterior. The black gelding had a reputation. Anyone with sense would hesitate. Seraphine just nodded once. "Which saddle?" Dutch made a sound that might have been a laugh or a cough. "Girl's got nerve, I'll give her that." "Nerve don't keep you on a horse's back," muttered Pike, one of the younger hands. "She'll be eating dirt inside of 10 seconds. Seraphine dismounted smoothly, not bothering to respond to the comment. She led her mare toward the barn, moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that came from years of handling animals. Cade found himself watching the way she walked. No unnecessary movements, no wasted energy. She tied the mare, grabbed a saddle that looked well-maintained despite its age, and headed toward the far corral without another word. The entire crew followed. Even the men who'd been working in the barn drifted over, drawn by the prospect of watching someone get thrown by the meanest horse on the property. Cade should have stopped this, should have recognized that letting a strange woman risk her neck on that animal was a liability he didn't need. But something about Seraphine's confidence intrigued him, or maybe irritated him. Either way, he wanted to see what happened when that confidence met reality. The black gelding watched their approach with ears pinned flat against his skull. He paced the corral's edge, snorting, muscles coiled tight beneath his dark coat. "You sure about this?" Dutch asked quietly, coming up beside Cade. "That horse damn near killed Thompson when he tried last month." "She chose to be here," Cade said. "I'm just giving her what she asked for." Seraphine set the saddle down carefully outside the corral and stood studying the horse. She didn't rush forward or make any aggressive moves, just watched. The gelding watched back, stamping occasionally, sides heaving with breath that wasn't from exertion, but from tension. Then Seraphine did something none of them expected. She climbed into the corral empty-handed. "What's she doing?" Pike hissed. "She's not even going to try to rope him first?" The black gelding noticed her immediately. His head came up, eyes rolling. For a moment, Cade thought the horse would charge. He'd seen that look before, right before an animal decided to remove a threat with hooves and teeth. But Seraphine didn't move like a threat. She walked slowly toward the center of the corral and then stopped, turning her back to the horse. Just stood there, relaxed, like she was alone in an empty field instead of sharing close quarters with an animal that had hospitalized grown men. "She's insane," someone muttered. "Maybe." But Cade found himself leaning forward against the fence rail, watching closely. The gelding approached, cautious, suspicious. It circled Seraphine once, testing, waiting for her to make a sudden move that would justify kicking or biting. She didn't. She simply stood, and after a moment she started talking. Too soft for Cade to hear the words, but the tone carried. Calm. Steady. Not coaxing or commanding, just present. The horse's ears flicked forward. Time stretched. The afternoon sun beat down on the corral, and still Seraphine stood there with the black gelding circling, drawing closer each time. Finally, the horse stopped directly behind her, close enough that one kick would end this whole stupid experiment. Instead, it lowered its head and sniffed her shoulder. "I'll be damned," Dutch breathed. Seraphine turned slowly. The gelding didn't spook. She raised one hand, gradual, non-threatening, and after a pause, the horse allowed her to touch its neck, then its shoulder, then its flank. "How the hell?" Pike's voice trailed off. Cade didn't have an answer. He'd worked with difficult horses his entire life, and what he was watching didn't fit any pattern he recognized. This wasn't breaking an animal through force or persistence. This was something else entirely. Something that suggested Seraphine Vale had experience that went far beyond typical ranch work. It took her another 20 minutes to get the halter on, then the saddle blanket, then the saddle itself. The gelding tolerated each step, still tense, still unpredictable, but no longer looking for an excuse to explode. When Seraphine finally swung up into the saddle, the horse danced sideways and half-reared, testing. She sat the motion easily, balanced, one hand firm on the reins while the other rested calmly on her thigh. The gelding tried again, a sharper buck this time, meant to unseat. Seraphine adjusted smoothly, moving with the animal instead of fighting against it. Then she guided the horse forward, not forcing it, not hauling on the reins or digging in spurs, just asking. And after a moment of resistance, the black gelding responded. They walked the perimeter of the corral, then again. Then Seraphine pushed into a trot, and the horse, the same animal that had thrown 3 experienced cowboys, obeyed. "Someone wake me up," Pike said weakly. Seraphine brought the gelding back to a walk, then a halt near the fence where Cade stood. The horse was breathing hard, sweat darkening its coat, but the wildness had drained from its eyes. Seraphine looked down at Cade, and for the first time since arriving, she showed the faintest hint of a smile. "Control enough for you?" Cade realized he'd been holding his breath. He let it out slowly. "Where'd you learn to do that?" The smile disappeared. "Long story. We've got time." "No," Seraphine said quietly. "We don't." She dismounted, handed the reins to a stunned Pike, and walked back toward where she'd left her own horse. The crew parted for her like water around a rock, too surprised to even mock anymore. Dutch sidled up next to Cade. "Well, didn't see that coming." "No." "You gonna let her stay?" Cade watched Seraphine untie her mare and lead it toward the barn. She moved like someone who expected to be allowed to stay, like the question had already been answered by what she'd just accomplished. And maybe it had been. "Yeah," Cade said finally, "for now. The boys ain't gonna like it." "The boys can adjust." Dutch grunted, which could have meant anything. Then he headed back toward the barn, leaving Cade alone at the corral fence. The black gelding stood quietly now, the violence drained out of it. Cade had the unsettling feeling that he'd just witnessed something he didn't fully understand, and that Seraphine Vale was far more dangerous than any half-wild horse. That evening, Cade showed Seraphine to the small cabin that sat about 100 yards from the main ranch house. It wasn't much. One room, a stove, a bed frame without a mattress, and windows that probably leaked when the wind picked up. But it was private, which seemed important given the alternative was sharing space with a crew of men who still didn't know what to make of her. "You'll eat with us in the main house," Cade said, standing in the doorway while Seraphine surveyed the interior. "Breakfast at dawn, dinner after the work's done. You miss meals, you go hungry, we don't keep individual schedules." "Understood. Tomorrow you start with the horses. Dutch will show you which ones need exercising and which ones have specific issues. After that, we'll see where else you fit." Seraphine set her saddlebags down on the rough wooden floor. "And the gelding? What about him?" "He'll need consistent handling now. Can't just leave him to backslide after today." Cade leaned against the door frame. "You volunteering?" "I'm saying if you want that horse to be useful, someone's got to keep working with him. May as well be me since I started it." She had a point, even if Cade was reluctant to admit it. The black gelding represented a significant investment that had so far produced nothing but frustration. If Seraphine could actually turn the animal into something rideable, it would justify keeping her around even before factoring in the original challenge. "Fine," Cade said, "but don't neglect the rest of the work. Everyone carries their weight here." I noticed. Something about her tone made him look closer. Seraphine had moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening ranch yard. In profile, her expression was unreadable, but Cade caught something in her posture, a tension that hadn't been there during the horse demonstration, like she was watching for something or watching for someone. "You running from something?" he asked bluntly. Seraphine didn't turn. "Everyone out here is running from something." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm giving tonight." Cade felt a spike of irritation, which was fair. She'd shown up on his property, aced his test, and was now refusing to explain anything about herself beyond a name. But pushing too hard too fast seemed likely to send her riding back out as quickly as she'd ridden in, and he found himself reluctant to let that happen. Not yet. Not until he understood what he was dealing with. "All right," he said. "But Vale? If whatever you're running from shows up here, it becomes my problem too. I've got enough problems without taking on anyone else's." Now she did turn, meeting his eyes directly. "Then I'll make sure it doesn't become your problem." "How?" "By handling it myself." The certainty in her voice should have been reassuring. Instead, it left Cade with the distinct impression that Seraphine expected trouble to follow her eventually, and that when it did, her method of handling it might be worse than the trouble itself. He left her alone after that, walking back through the gathering dusk toward the main house where lights already glowed in the windows. Inside, the crew would be speculating about the new arrival, placing bets on how long she'd last, questioning whether Cade had lost his mind by letting her stay. He questioned it himself, but when he glanced back toward the small cabin, he saw Seraphine silhouetted in the window, still watching the road like she expected riders to appear out of the darkness at any moment. And Cade realized that whatever she was running from, it was close enough that she could feel it breathing down her neck. The first week passed without incident, which surprised everyone. Seraphine worked from dawn until the light failed, and sometimes longer. She exercised the horses that needed it, doctored the ones with injuries or illness, and spent hours with the black gelding until the animal responded to her with something approaching trust. She mucked stalls without complaint, hauled hay, repaired tack, and generally proved herself more capable than half the men on the crew. The ranch hands stopped mocking and started resenting, which Cade figured was progress of a sort. "She's making us look bad," Pike grumbled one evening after Seraphine had spent 6 straight hours repairing a section of fence that should have taken 3 men twice as long. "Then maybe you should work harder," Dutch suggested mildly. "It ain't natural. Woman shouldn't be that strong." "Strong's got nothing to do with it," said a wiry older hand named Curtis. "It's about knowing what you're doing and not wasting time complaining. Something you could learn from, Pike." The younger man scowled but didn't argue further, which was probably wise. Curtis had been working ranches longer than Pike had been alive, and nobody questioned his authority when it came to judging someone's work ethic. But Pike wasn't entirely wrong about the unnaturalness of it. Cade watched Seraphine work and saw someone who pushed herself past reasonable limits, like she was trying to outrun something even while standing still. She barely spoke except when necessary. She ate quickly and efficiently at meals, always sitting at the table's edge where she could see the door. And every evening when the work finally ended, she returned to her cabin and stayed there until dawn. No socializing, no questions about the ranch or the other workers. Just work and solitude. On the 8th day, Cade found her in the barn after everyone else had turned in. She was cleaning tack by lantern light, hands moving steadily over worn leather. "You don't have to do this tonight," Cade said from the doorway. "It'll keep until morning." "Rather finish it now." He walked inside, letting the door swing shut behind him. The barn smelled of hay and horses and old wood, familiar and grounding. Seraphine didn't look up from her work. "You're making the men nervous," Cade said. "Because I work harder than they do?" "Because you work like you're being chased." Her hands paused for just a second before resuming their steady rhythm. "Maybe I am." "Then tell me what's chasing you." "Why?" "Because I'm tired of wondering when it's going to show up." Seraphine set down the saddle soap and finally looked at him. In the dim lantern light, her face seemed even more angular, shadows pooling beneath her cheekbones. "You really want to know?" she asked quietly. "Would I be asking if I didn't?" She studied him for a long moment, and Cade had the uncomfortable feeling of being evaluated, measured against some standard he couldn't see. "I took something," Seraphine said finally, "from someone who didn't like losing it." "What kind of something?" The kind that proves powerful men have been stealing from people who can't fight back. Cade felt something cold settle in his stomach. You're talking about land fraud. Among other things. Land fraud wasn't uncommon in the territories. Wealthy speculators and corrupt officials had been running schemes for years, forging claims, intimidating settlers, using legal technicalities to steal property from families who'd worked it for generations. Most folks knew it happened. Most were too scared or too powerless to do anything about it. And you stole their evidence, Cade said. I stole back the original documents, the real ownership papers that prove who actually has rights to the land they're trying to claim. Jesus, Vale, you know what kind of people run operations like that? Better than you do. Then you know they don't just let someone walk away with evidence that could destroy them. I'm counting on it. The words hung in the barn's dusty air. Cade tried to process what she'd just implied, that she'd deliberately stolen documentation from dangerous men and was now waiting for them to come after her. Why? He asked. Why take that risk? Seraphine picked up the saddle soap again, but her hands weren't quite steady anymore. Because someone had to. Because those families were losing everything and nobody with power gave a damn. Because... She stopped, jaw tightening. Because running didn't work the first time. First time? They took land from my family 3 years ago. Used the same tricks, the same forged papers, the same threats. My father tried to fight legally. They killed him and made it look like an accident. My mother... Seraphine's voice went flat. My mother couldn't survive losing both the ranch and him, so I learned how their system worked. I learned who kept the documents and where. And when I finally had a chance, I took them. Cade sat down slowly on a hay bale, trying to absorb this. How many families are we talking about? 17. Spread across 3 territories. Some of them don't even know yet that they're about to lose everything. And you have the proof that could stop it. Hidden, Seraphine said. Safe. Copies went to a lawyer in the capital who owes me a favor. Original documents are somewhere these men will never find them. Then why are they still chasing you? Because I'm loose, she said simply. Because as long as I'm alive and free, I can testify. I can point fingers. I can make noise that they can't silence. She met his eyes again. They need me dead or discredited, preferably dead. The lantern flickered, casting moving shadows across the barn walls. Cade thought about the black gelding, the way Seraphine had gentled it through patience instead of force. Thought about the way she worked, relentless, driven, like every day might be her last chance to prove her worth. When are they coming? He asked. I don't know. Could be tomorrow, could be next month, but they're coming. And when they get here? Seraphine's expression hardened. That depends on whether you're planning to hand me over. Cade should have said yes. Should have told her to pack her things and leave tonight before she brought a war to his doorstep. He had a ranch to run, men depending on him, a life he'd built through years of hard work. Harboring a fugitive, even one with a righteous cause, was a risk he couldn't afford. But when he looked at Seraphine, he didn't see a criminal or even a crusader. He saw someone who'd made the same mistake he had once, believing that hard work and honesty were enough to protect what mattered. Nobody's handing you over, Cade said, but we're not going to pretend they're not coming either. When they show up, we need to be ready. Something shifted in Seraphine's expression. Surprise, maybe, or relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. You don't owe me this, she said quietly. No, but you answered my challenge, and that means something, even if it wasn't the challenge I thought I was offering. For the first time since she'd ridden onto the ranch, Seraphine smiled. Not much of one, barely there at all, but genuine. Thank you. Cade stood, brushing hay from his pants. Don't thank me yet. We don't know what's coming. I know exactly what's coming, Seraphine said. That's why I'm thanking you. Ashiso. 3 days later, Dutch found the wanted notice. It was nailed to a tree about a half-mile from the ranch, close enough to the main road that any traveler would see it. The poster was crude but effective. A rough sketch of a woman's face, dark-haired and sharp-featured, above text offering a substantial reward for information leading to her capture. The name on the poster wasn't Seraphine Vale. It was Sarah Valdez. Dutch brought it to Cade without showing anyone else. They stood in the ranch house office, the poster spread across the desk between them. That her? Dutch asked, though they both knew the answer. Close enough. Rewards $500. That's serious money for just information, which means whoever's offering it has serious resources. Dutch leaned against the desk, arms crossed. You still sure about keeping her here? Cade looked at the sketch again. Whoever had drawn it knew Seraphine's face, had seen her up close. The details were too accurate to be based on a vague description. She told me the truth, Cade said. Or close enough to it. These people are coming regardless of what we do. Then maybe we should prepare the men. And tell them what? That we're hiding a fugitive who stole from powerful criminals? Better they hear it from us than figure it out themselves when riders show up asking questions. Cade rubbed his face, exhaustion settling into his bones. Dutch was right, but that didn't make the conversation any easier. The crew had finally started accepting Seraphine as a legitimate worker instead of an outsider playing at ranch life. Revealing her real situation might shatter that fragile acceptance. Tonight, Cade decided. After dinner, we tell them everything and let them decide whether they want to stay or go. And if they all decide to go, then we'll deal with it. But I'm not throwing Seraphine to those men without a fight, even if it's just me and her against whoever shows up. Dutch studied him with an expression Cade couldn't quite read. You sweet on her, boss? It's not about that. Then what's it about? Cade looked down at the wanted poster, at the desperate urgency in that hastily sketched face. It's about doing what's right instead of what's easy, he said, even when it's stupid. Dutch snorted. Well, it's definitely stupid, but I'm in anyway. I haven't asked yet. Don't need to. You're going to tell the crew tonight, and some of them will probably walk, but some will stay, and I'll be one of them, because I've worked for you 5 years, and you've never steered me wrong yet. He straightened, headed toward the door, then paused. But boss, you should know. Pike's been asking around town about strangers looking for someone, acting like he's just making conversation, but it's specific enough to be suspicious. Cade's hand tightened on the poster. You think he knows? I think Pike's got more ambition than loyalty, and $500 would set him up nice somewhere else. Keep an eye on him. If he tries to leave before tonight's conversation, stop him. Gently. Define gently. However you need to. Dutch nodded and left. Cade stayed in the office, staring at the wanted poster until the sketch started to blur, imagining scenarios where this ended without bloodshed and finding none that felt believable. Finally, he folded the poster and locked it in his desk drawer. Then he went to find Seraphine and tell her that time had just run out. She took the news calmly. They were in the far pasture checking fence posts when Cade told her about the poster. Seraphine listened without interrupting, her hands continuing to work even as her expression tightened. How long do we have? She asked when he finished. No way to know. Could be days, could be hours. And your men? I'm telling them tonight, giving them the choice to stay or go. Seraphine hammered a post deeper into the ground, movements controlled despite the obvious tension in her shoulders. Most will go. Maybe. You should let them. This isn't their fight. It is if they choose to make it theirs. She looked at him then, really looked, like she was trying to understand something that didn't fit her expectations. Why are you doing this? You barely know me. I know enough. That doesn't answer the question. Cade leaned against the fence rail, choosing his words carefully. When I was younger, I had a sister, Rachel. She got involved with a man who seemed decent enough at first. By the time we realized he wasn't, she was already trapped. He controlled everything, her money, her movements, who she could talk to. Seraphine had stopped working, listening. She tried to leave 3 times, Cade continued. Each time he found her. Made things worse. She was planning a 4th attempt when he stopped, swallowed hard. When she decided dying was easier than trying again. The silence stretched between them, filled with the distant sound of cattle and wind moving through grass. I didn't help her enough, Cade said quietly. I believed her when she said she could handle it. I trusted that the law would intervene eventually. I did everything except actually stand between her and the man who was destroying her. He met Seraphine's eyes. I'm not making that mistake again. This is different, Seraphine said. Your sister was innocent. So are the families you're trying to protect. But I'm not. I stole documents, broke laws. Laws written by the same people trying to steal land from honest families. That doesn't count. Seraphine turned away, but not before Cade saw the moisture gathering in her eyes. When she spoke again, her voice was rough. If they come and I'm not enough to stop them, if they're going to burn this place down to get to me, I want you to promise me something." "What?" "That you'll shoot me yourself before you let them take me alive." The request hit Cade like a physical blow. "That's not—" "Promise me." She turned back, and the desperation in her face was devastating. "You don't know what they'll do if they catch me. It won't be quick, and it won't be clean. So if it comes down to that choice, I need to know someone here will have the mercy to end it fast." Cade wanted to refuse, wanted to promise that it wouldn't come to that they'd find another way. But he'd seen enough frontier justice to know that mercy was often the cruelest kindness available. "All right," he said, "but only if there's no other choice." "There won't be. You don't know that." "Yes," Seraphine said softly. "I do." They finished the fence in silence after that, working side by side as the sun climbed toward noon. Cade kept replaying her requests, trying to imagine circumstances where he'd actually have to follow through, and finding that every scenario ended with violence he desperately wanted to avoid. When they finally headed back toward the ranch house, Seraphine stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Thank you," she said, "for believing me, for not sending me away. You earned your place here." "I know, but that doesn't mean you had to let me keep it." They walked the rest of the way in silence, both knowing that the easy part was already over, and everything that came next would test loyalties and courage in ways neither of them could fully predict. 1. That evening, after the meal was finished and the dishes cleared, Cade gathered the crew in the main house's largest room. 8 men total, including Dutch. All of them knew something serious was coming from the way Cade had called the meeting, but none knew exactly what. Seraphine stood near the back wall, arms crossed, face carefully neutral. Cade didn't waste time on preamble. "Most of you have been wondering about Seraphine," he started. "Where she came from, why she's here, what she's running from. Tonight you're getting the truth, and then you're getting a choice." He explained everything: the land fraud, the stolen documents, the men hunting her, the wanted poster Dutch had found. He laid it all out plainly, not softening anything or trying to make Seraphine's situation sound more noble or less dangerous than it actually was. When he finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Pike stood up. "You're asking us to get killed for a woman we barely know, over crimes she actually committed? I'm asking you to stand against men who steal from families that can't defend themselves," Cade said evenly. "And I'm giving you the choice to leave if you can't stomach that." "Damn right I'm leaving." Pike looked around at the others. "Anyone with sense will do the same. This isn't our fight. Let her hang for her own decisions." "That's your right," Cade said. "Dutch will pay you through today. You can collect your things and be gone by morning." Pike's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly and walked out. His footsteps echoed through the house, then faded. "Anyone else?" Cade asked. Curtis spoke up from his seat near the window. "These men coming after her, they dangerous?" "Very." "Armed?" "Likely. And if we stand with her, we're risking everything? Our lives, our jobs, all of it?" "Yes." Curtis nodded slowly. "Good. Been too long since I had something worth fighting for besides a paycheck." A few surprised laughs rippled through the group. Dutch grinned. "I'm staying too," said a stocky hand named Garrett, "mostly because I'm curious to see how this plays out." "That's a terrible reason," Dutch observed. "Maybe, but it's my reason." One by one, the others declared their intentions. Most stayed. 2 more left with Pike, and Cade let them go without argument. When the room finally settled, he was left with 6 men, not counting Seraphine, which was more than he'd expected, but fewer than he'd hoped. Dutch stood. "All right then. If we're doing this, we need to prepare properly. Windows need boarding, weapons need cleaning. We should establish watches." "Yeshe." "No." Everyone turned to look at Seraphine. She'd stayed silent throughout the entire conversation, but now she stepped forward, expression troubled. "This is wrong," she said. "You're all being stupid and reckless, and I won't let you die for me." "Bit late for that," Garrett pointed out. "We already chose." "Then unchoose. I can leave tonight. Lead them away from here." "And get caught alone on the road?" Dutch shook his head. "That's suicide." "It's my suicide to commit, except you promised to testify," Cade said quietly. "You promised those 17 families that you'd expose what happened. If you die running, you break that promise. Seraphine's hands clenched into fists. And if you die defending me, how is that better? Because some things are worth dying for, even if you haven't figured that out yet. The words hung heavy in the room. Seraphine looked like she wanted to argue further but couldn't find the words. Finally, she turned away, shoulders tight with frustration or fear or both. Then we do this properly, she said. No half measures. If those men come here, we make sure they regret it. Cade nodded. Dutch, start making that list. Everyone else, get some rest. Tomorrow, we start preparing for war. The men filed out slowly, talking in low voices. When the room was empty except for Cade and Seraphine, she finally looked at him again. This is going to go bad, she said. Probably. I'm sorry. Don't be. Not yet. She almost smiled. When should I be sorry? After we win. Seraphine shook her head, but some of the tension drained from her posture. You're an optimist, Mercer. Someone has to be. She left after that, heading back to her cabin through the dark. Cade watched her go and wondered if optimism would be enough when the riders finally arrived. He suspected they'd find out soon. Bas-Sab. The riders came 2 nights later, just after midnight. Cade woke to Dutch pounding on his door, already dressed and armed. Horses on the road, Dutch said shortly. Coming fast. At least a dozen. Cade was up and moving before fully processing the words. He grabbed his rifle, checked the ammunition, and headed outside where the rest of the crew was already gathering. Seraphine emerged from her cabin, fully dressed, a rifle of her own held with comfortable familiarity. Positions, Cade ordered. Nobody fires unless I give the word. The men scattered to pre-planned defensive points, windows, doorways, the hayloft. Seraphine moved to the porch of the main house, standing in clear view, rifle lowered but ready. You should be inside, Cade said, joining her. They came for me. They should see me. The riders materialized out of the darkness like demons, surrounding the ranch yard in a loose circle. Cade counted 13 total, all mounted, all armed. Their leader, a tall man with a thin face and expensive clothes, rode slightly ahead of the others. Evening, the man called out. His voice was cultured, educated, the voice of someone used to being obeyed. My name is Harrison Whitmore. I believe you have something that belongs to my associates. Your associates can go to hell, Seraphine called back. Whitmore smiled, but it was a cold thing. Miss Valdez, or is it Vale now? Hard to keep track of all your aliases. What do you want, Whitmore? The documents you stole. The originals, not copies. Return them tonight and we'll leave peacefully. And if I don't? Then we'll burn this ranch to the ground and sift through the ashes looking for them. Cade stepped forward, rifle coming up slightly. This ranch isn't part of your business. Take your threats and ride back where you came from. Whitmore's attention shifted to Cade, assessing. You're Mercer, the owner. That's right. Then surely you understand business decisions, Mr. Mercer. That woman is a thief and a criminal. Sheltering her makes you an accomplice. I'm offering you a chance to walk away from this with your property intact. Funny thing about chances, Cade said. I'm not taking yours. The temperature in the yard seemed to drop. Whitmore's smile faded completely. Then you're a fool, he said quietly. A noble fool, perhaps, but a dead one. Maybe, but I'll die knowing I did the right thing. Can you say the same? For a long moment, nobody moved. Cade could feel his crew positioned around the ranch, could sense Seraphine tense beside him. The riders watched, waiting for orders. And then Seraphine did something completely unexpected. She stepped forward, away from cover, rifle still lowered. The documents aren't here, she said clearly. Even if you burn this place down, you won't find them. They're already gone. Whitmore leaned forward in his saddle. Explain. I sent copies to lawyers in 3 territories. Lawyers who now have instructions to release everything to newspapers and territorial governments if anything happens to me. You're bluffing. Try me. The confidence in her voice carried weight. Cade saw uncertainty ripple through the mounted men, saw Whitmore's jaw tighten. Even if that's true, Whitmore said slowly, we can still make you disappear. Make it look like an accident. And risk having those documents released anyway? Seraphine shook her head. You're smarter than that, Whitmore. You know that killing me now would be the worst possible move for your operation. Then what are you proposing? I'm proposing you turn around and ride away. Tell your associates that the game is over. Those 17 families are protected now, and there's nothing you can do about it without exposing yourselves." The silence that followed was electric. Cade's hand was tight on his rifle, ready to raise and fire if this conversation turned violent. Around him, he could feel the crew waiting, poised. Whitmore stared at Seraphine for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. "You've won," he said finally, and the words sounded like poison in his mouth. "This round, at least. There won't be another round. We'll see." Whitmore turned his horse, gesturing to his men. They wheeled around, the circle breaking, horses streaming back toward the road. Seraphine and Cade watched them disappear into the darkness, neither moving until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Then Seraphine's legs buckled. Cade caught her before she fell, rifle clattering to the porch. She was shaking violently, all the strength she'd projected during the confrontation draining out in a rush. "I've got you," Cade said quietly. "You're safe." "I thought—" Her voice broke. "I thought they'd shoot us all right there." "But they didn't. Because I bluffed. Because I lied about where the documents are and prayed they'd believe me." Cade helped her sit on the porch steps. The crew was emerging from cover, voices raised in relief and celebration. Dutch appeared with a bottle of whiskey, passing it around. "Where are the documents?" Cade asked quietly. Seraphine looked up at him, eyes red. "Exactly where I said. With lawyers. With instructions." "So you weren't bluffing?" "I was bluffing that they'd care more about exposure than revenge. But they did. They actually—" She laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. "They actually left." Cade sat beside her, letting the celebration continue around them. "You saved us all tonight. You saved me first. Then I guess we're even." Seraphine leaned against him, exhaustion and relief mixing into something that left her trembling. "What happens now?" "Now?" Cade looked out at the dark frontier, at the ranch that had survived another night. "Now we rebuild. Properly. Together. As partners? If you'll have me." This time when Seraphine smiled, it reached her eyes. "I think I already answered that challenge, Mercer." And in the darkness, with his crew celebrating around them and the frontier stretching endlessly beyond, Cade thought maybe, just maybe, he'd finally found what he'd been looking for when he'd posted that notice all those months ago. Not just someone who could survive the ranch, but someone who could help it become something better. The celebration didn't last long. Within an hour, the whiskey was gone, and the reality of what had just happened began settling over the ranch like morning frost. The crew drifted back to their quarters in small groups, voices subdued now, the initial rush of survival giving way to exhaustion and delayed fear. Cade stayed on the porch with Seraphine until the last man disappeared into the bunkhouse. She'd stopped shaking but hadn't moved from where she sat on the steps, staring out at the darkness where Whitmore's riders had vanished. "You should get some sleep," Cade said finally. "Can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see them coming back." "They won't, not tonight. You don't know that." "No," Cade admitted. "But I know they believed you enough to leave. That's something." Seraphine pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. In the faint lamplight from the house, she looked younger than her years, vulnerable in a way she'd never allowed before. "I keep thinking about what happens next," she said quietly. "Those documents are safe. The lawyers have their instructions, but Whitmore and his people don't just disappear because they lost one confrontation. They'll regroup, find another angle. Then we'll deal with that when it comes. And if they go after the families directly, the ones I was trying to protect? Can they? Without the forged documents? They can intimidate, threaten, make life difficult enough that people give up their claims anyway." She pressed her forehead against her knees. "I thought exposing them would be enough. That truth would win. But truth doesn't mean anything if you can't enforce it." Cade had no good answer for that. She was right. Exposure might slow the fraud operation, but it wouldn't stop men like Whitmore completely. Power protected itself, and the frontier was still a place where wealth and violence often mattered more than legal documents. "So what do you want to do?" he asked. Seraphine looked up at him. "I want to make sure those families actually get their land back. Not just prevent it from being stolen, but actively return what was already taken. That's a bigger fight than just keeping documents safe." "I know. It'll take lawyers, money, time, probably more confrontations like tonight." I know that too. Cade studied her face, seeing determination hardening beneath the exhaustion. You're not planning to stay here, are you? The question hung between them. Seraphine's expression shifted, something like regret crossing her features. I came here to hide, she said, to survive long enough to get those documents to people who could use them. But now that it's done, I can't just stop. Those families need someone to see this through. And you think that someone has to be you. It was my family's land that got stolen first. My father who died trying to fight it. If I don't finish what he started, then what was any of it for? Cade felt something twist in his chest. He'd known from the beginning that Seraphine was temporary, that she'd ridden onto his ranch chasing something bigger than a marriage challenge. But hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way he hadn't wanted to face. When? He asked. Soon. A few days, maybe. I need to contact the lawyers, coordinate with the families, figure out which cases are strongest to pursue first. She turned to look at him directly. I'm sorry, I know you were expecting something different when you posted that challenge. I was expecting someone who could survive the frontier, Cade said. Turns out I got someone who's trying to change it instead. Can't really complain about that. You could, most men would. I'm not most men. Seraphine smiled faintly. No, you're really not. They sat in silence for a while longer, both lost in separate thoughts about futures that suddenly felt less certain than they had a few hours ago. Finally, Seraphine stood, stretching stiff muscles. I should try to sleep, she said, even if it's just a few hours. Seraphine? She paused at the edge of the porch. When you leave, Cade said carefully, you don't have to do it alone. If you need help with the families, with the lawyers, with any of it, the offer stands. You'd leave the ranch? For a few weeks, if necessary. Dutch can manage things here, and what you're doing matters more than whether the fence posts get replaced on schedule. Something complicated passed across Seraphine's face. I'll think about it. She disappeared into the darkness toward her cabin, leaving Cade alone with the night and the uncomfortable realization that he'd gotten exactly what he'd asked for in his challenge, and was about to lose it anyway. The next morning arrived too quickly, and with complications nobody had anticipated. Cade woke to raised voices from the yard and emerged to find Pike standing near the barn with his horse saddled, facing down Dutch and Curtis. Let me pass, Pike was saying, voice tight with anger. Boss said nobody leaves until he gives the word, Dutch replied, arms crossed. I left last night, during the meeting, remember? And then you came back, which means you stayed for the fight. I came back for my things. There's a difference. Cade walked down from the porch, still pulling his shirt on. What's going on? Pike turned to him, jaw set. I'm leaving, right now. These two are trying to stop me. Why come back at all if you were planning to leave anyway? Something flickered in Pike's expression. Guilt, maybe, or calculation. I forgot some gear, came back to collect it. In the middle of a confrontation with armed riders? I waited until they left. How'd you know they'd left? You weren't here for the confrontation. Pike's jaw tightened further, and Cade saw Curtis and Dutch exchange glances. They'd all arrived at the same conclusion simultaneously. You were watching, Cade said quietly, from somewhere out in the dark, waiting to see how it ended. So what if I was? I wanted to know if I still had a job to come back to. Or you wanted to know if Seraphine would be dead or captured so you could collect that reward. The accusation hung in the morning air. Pike's hand drifted toward his gun, then stopped when he realized 3 rifles were already trained on him. That's a serious charge, Pike said carefully. It's also true. Dutch told me you were asking questions in town about strangers looking for someone. You knew about the poster before any of us did, and you left the meeting right before the writers showed up. Convenient timing. I didn't bring them here. No, but you probably sent word somehow. Let them know where to find her. Pike's face flushed red. You can't prove that. Don't need to prove it. Just need to decide what to do about it. For a long moment, nobody moved. Pike's horse stamped nervously, sensing the tension. Cade felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Pike was a traitor, yes, but shooting him in cold blood felt wrong. Then again, letting him ride away to possibly cause more trouble felt equally dangerous. Here's what's going to happen, Cade said finally. You're leaving, right now. But you're leaving with nothing except the clothes you're wearing and that horse. Everything else, your pay, Your gear, all of it, stays here. That's theft. Call it payment for damages. You brought armed men to my ranch. Consider yourself lucky I'm letting you leave breathing." Pike looked like he wanted to argue, but the rifles didn't waver. Finally, he mounted his horse, movement stiff with suppressed rage. "You're making a mistake protecting her," he spat. "Those men will come back, and when they do, don't expect any help from town. Everyone knows what she did." "Then everyone can stay in town," Cade replied. "Now ride." Pike kicked his horse forward, and the crew parted to let him through. They watched him disappear down the road, dust rising in his wake. "Think he'll make trouble?" Curtis asked. "Probably. But there's not much more trouble he can make that we're not already dealing with." Dutch spat into the dirt. "Should have shot him." "Maybe. But I'm tired of all this nearly turning into bloodshed." "Welcome to the frontier," Dutch said dryly, "where everything nearly turns into bloodshed right up until it actually does." Seraphine emerged from her cabin as they were dispersing, looking drawn but alert. She took in their expressions and the recently departed dust cloud. "Pike?" she asked. "Gone," Cade confirmed. "Turns out he was working both sides." "I could have told you that. Men like him always do." "Wish you'd mentioned it earlier." "Would you have believed me before last night?" Cade thought about it. "Probably not." "There you go." She walked toward the barn, then paused. "I'm going into town today. Need to send some telegrams, talk to the land office about filing procedures. Thought you should know." "You sure that's smart? If Pike's already spreading word?" "Let him. The documents are filed, the lawyers have copies, and Whitmore backed down. I'm done hiding. Seraphine, I'll be careful, but this needs to happen. Those families need to know someone's fighting for them." She continued toward the barn before Cade could argue further. Dutch appeared at his elbow. "You gonna let her go alone?" "Doesn't seem like I have much choice." "Could go with her." "She doesn't want protection. She wants to prove she can handle this herself." Dutch grunted. "Pride's gonna get her killed." "Maybe, but it's her pride to risk." They watched Seraphine saddle her mare, movements efficient despite obvious fatigue. When she rode out 20 minutes later, she didn't look back. Cade tried to focus on ranch work, but his attention kept drifting toward the road. Curtis noticed and made a pointed comment about lovesick fools that Cade ignored. By midday, the tension had spread to the rest of the crew. Everyone was working, but nobody's heart was in it. "This is ridiculous," Garrett said finally, throwing down the fence post he'd been setting. "We're all standing around waiting for something bad to happen instead of actually working." "Then work," Cade snapped. "Can't. Keep thinking about town and whether she's all right. She can take care of herself." "Sure. Just like she took care of herself when Whitmore's riders showed up. Oh wait, she needed all of us for that." Cade wanted to argue but couldn't find the ground to stand on. Garrett was right. Seraphine was tough and capable, but she was also one woman walking into a town that probably knew by now she was wanted by powerful men. If Pike had been talking, and he almost certainly had been, then the locals would either be too scared to help her or too tempted by the reward to let her leave peacefully. "Fine," Cade said, already untying his horse. "Dutch, you're in charge. I'm going to town. Want company?" "No. If there's trouble, I don't want the whole ranch getting involved." "Bit late for that logic, boss." "Maybe." But Cade was already mounting up, anxious energy finally finding a direction. He pushed the horse faster than was probably safe, eating up the miles between the ranch and town while scenarios played out in his head. Most of them ended badly. The town of Redemption sat at the junction of two trade roads, small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, but large enough to support a general store, saloon, land office, and telegraph station. Cade had been coming here for supplies since he'd established the ranch, and the locals generally left him alone. But when he rode in that afternoon, the atmosphere felt different, hostile. People watched from doorways and windows, conversations dying as he passed. By the time he reached the land office, a small crowd had gathered in the street. Seraphine's mare was tied outside. Relief and worry hit Cade simultaneously. He dismounted and pushed through the land office door. Inside, Seraphine stood at the counter arguing with a thin, nervous-looking clerk, while a well-dressed man with a sheriff's badge leaned against the wall watching. "Can't file these claims without proper documentation," the clerk was saying. "I have documentation right here." Seraphine slapped a folder on the counter. "Original deeds for 7 properties currently held under fraudulent titles." That's a serious accusation, miss. It's the truth. And if you'd actually look at what I'm showing you instead of pretending to be busy. Problem here? Kate asked, stepping inside. The sheriff straightened. That depends. You with this woman, Mercer? I am. Then you're either very brave or very stupid. Word is she's wanted by some powerful people. Word is wrong. She's wanted by criminals who've been stealing land through fraud. There's a difference. The sheriff's expression didn't change. All I know is I got a telegram this morning suggesting I keep an eye out for a woman matching her description. Dangerous, it said. Possibly armed. I am armed, Seraphine said flatly, but I'm not dangerous to anyone except land thieves and corrupt officials. Which category do you fall into, Sheriff? Watch your mouth, girl. Or what? You'll arrest me? On what charge? Being inconvenient to rich men? The tension in the small office was thick enough to choke on. Cade moved to stand beside Seraphine, close enough that the sheriff would have to go through him to reach her. The lady's trying to file legitimate land claims, Cade said carefully. That's legal activity. Unless the law has changed recently? Law hasn't changed, but circumstances have. The sheriff pushed off from the wall. I can't stop her from filing, but I also can't guarantee her safety if certain people take issue with what she's doing. Is that a threat? It's a statement of fact. This is a small town, Mercer. We don't have the resources to protect people who make powerful enemies. Then maybe you should focus on stopping powerful people from creating enemies in the first place. The sheriff's mouth tightened. You're walking a dangerous line. Seems to be a common theme lately. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then the sheriff tipped his hat mockingly and walked out, leaving Cade and Seraphine alone with the nervous clerk. So, Seraphine said, turning back to the counter. About those filings. The clerk looked between them helplessly. Miss, I want to help. I really do. But if the sheriff's getting telegrams about you, and if powerful people are involved, these families have rights. Legal rights to land that was stolen from them through forged documents and intimidation. All I'm asking is that you process the paperwork according to the law. It's not that simple. Yes, it is. You look at the documents, you verify they're legitimate, and you update the records. That's your job. My job is also staying alive and employed. Seraphine's expression hardened. So you're refusing? I'm saying I need time to review everything properly, make sure there are no irregularities. How much time? 2 weeks? Maybe 3. That's not reviewing. That's stalling. The clerk's face flushed. Look, miss, I sympathize. I do. But you're asking me to take on people who could ruin my life with a telegram. People who've done it before to others who got in their way. So yes, I'm stalling, because I've got a family to feed and no desire to end up dead in a ditch somewhere. The raw fear in his voice seemed to cut through Seraphine's anger. Her shoulders sagged slightly. 3 weeks, she said quietly. But if you don't process these claims after that, I'll take this to the territorial governor myself, and I'll make sure everyone knows you were complicit in the fraud. That's fair, the clerk said, looking relieved. 3 weeks. Seraphine collected her documents and walked out. Cade followed, catching up to her on the street where a dozen townspeople were still watching. That went well, he said. That went terrible. 3 weeks is long enough for Whitmore to interfere with the filings, bribe officials, or just disappear the evidence entirely. So what's the alternative? I don't know. She untied her mare, movement sharp with frustration. I thought having the truth would be enough. I thought people would help once they saw what was really happening. People are scared, can't entirely blame them. I can, and I do. She swung into the saddle. This is why nothing ever changes, because everyone's too afraid to stand up when it matters. Hey, Cade caught her reins before she could ride off. You stood up. Last night you faced down armed men and won. That matters. Did it? Because right now it feels like I risked everything for nothing. Those families are still going to lose their land, just more slowly. Not if we find another way. What other way? The legal system is rigged, the sheriff's compromised, even the clerk. She stopped, taking a shaky breath. I'm tired, Mercer. I'm so damn tired of fighting battles I can't win. Cade wanted to offer reassurance, wanted to promise that everything would work out. But he'd never been good at lying, especially to someone who'd see right through it. Come back to the ranch, he said instead. Get some rest. We'll figure out the next move together. There is no we in this. It's my fight. Except it's not anymore. The moment Whitmore's riders came to my ranch, you made it all of ours. Seraphine looked down at him, and Cade saw exhaustion and desperation warring in her expression. Finally, she nodded. All right, but just for tonight. Tomorrow I'm heading to the capital to find those lawyers in person. Fine. We'll talk about it after you've slept. They rode back in silence, Cade acutely aware of the watching eyes following them out of town. By the time they reached the ranch, dusk was settling across the frontier, painting everything in shades of orange and purple. Dutch met them in the yard. How'd it go? About as well as expected, Cade said. Clerks stalling, sheriff's compromised, town scared. So, typical Tuesday. Something like that. Seraphine dismounted and headed straight for her cabin without another word. Dutch watched her go. She looks ready to break, he observed. She's been ready to break since she got here. Just been too stubborn to admit it. What's the plan? Cade unsaddled his horse, thinking. Tomorrow she wants to head to the capital. Talk to the lawyers directly. That's a long ride. Dangerous if Whitmore's people are watching the roads. I know. You planning to go with her? She doesn't want company. I didn't ask what she wants. I asked what you're planning. Cade finished with the horse and turned to face his foreman. I'm planning to do whatever keeps her alive long enough to finish what she started, even if she hates me for it. Dutch grinned. Now that sounds like an actual plan. That night, Cade couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Seraphine's face in the land office, the way hope had drained from her expression when the clerk refused to help. She'd ridden onto his ranch expecting a challenge she could win through skill and determination. Instead, she'd found a war that couldn't be won through either. Around midnight, he gave up on sleep and went outside. The ranch was quiet, just normal night sounds, cattle shifting in distant pastures, wind moving through the barn, an owl hunting somewhere nearby. But when Cade looked toward Seraphine's cabin, he saw lamplight in the window. He shouldn't intrude, should let her have whatever private time she needed to process the day. But his feet were already carrying him across the yard. He knocked softly. Seraphine? You awake? Obviously. The door opened. She'd changed into different clothes, but still looked tense, like sleep was as impossible for her as it had been for him. What do you want, Mercer? To talk, if you're willing. She hesitated, then stepped back to let him inside. The cabin's single room was sparse, her few belongings organized neatly, the bed unused, papers spread across the small table. Cade recognized property deeds and legal documents. Can't stop working? He asked. Can't stop thinking. She gestured at the papers. I keep going over these, looking for something I missed, some angle that makes this easier. And there isn't one. It's just going to be hard and dangerous and probably futile. She sank into the room's only chair. Tell me I'm not crazy for trying. Cade leaned against the doorframe. You're not crazy. Feel pretty crazy right now. That's just exhaustion talking. No, it's reality talking. I stole documents from dangerous men, got your ranch threatened, convinced you and your crew to risk everything. And for what? So some scared clerk can stall for 3 weeks while Whitmore's people regroup? You gave 17 families a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise. That's not nothing. It's not enough either. Maybe not, but it's more than most people would have done. Seraphine looked up at him, eyes red-rimmed. You know what the worst part is? I keep thinking about my father, how he tried to fight through legal channels and died for it, how my mother gave up after he was gone. And I promised myself I wouldn't make the same mistakes, that I'd be smarter, tougher, more prepared. Her voice cracked. But I'm not. I'm just repeating everything they did, expecting different results. Cade moved into the room, crouching beside her chair so they were at eye level. Your father fought alone. You're not alone. I should be. This isn't your fight. We've been over this. Have we? Because from where I'm sitting, you're about to lose everything you've built because some stranger rode onto your ranch and dragged you into her war. First, Cade said, you're not a stranger anymore. Second, I chose to help. Nobody forced me. And third, he paused, trying to find the right words. This ranch was just land and work before you showed up. Now it's something worth fighting for. You did that. Not by causing trouble, but by reminding me that some things matter more than just surviving day to day. Seraphine wiped at her eyes angrily. That's a pretty speech, Mercer, but pretty speeches don't stop men like Whitmore. No, but they remind us why we're fighting them in the first place. She laughed, a broken sound somewhere between humor and despair. You're too good for this. For all of it. Pretty sure I'm exactly what's needed. Stubborn, too dumb to quit, and apparently unable to let people fight alone. Those aren't virtues. On the frontier they are. They sat in silence for a moment, Seraphine staring at the papers scattered across her table, Cade watching her profile in the lamplight. Finally, she spoke again, quieter this time. If I leave tomorrow for the capital, will you try to stop me? No. Will you follow me anyway? Probably. Even though I asked you not to? Especially because you asked me not to. Means you think it's dangerous enough that you don't want me involved, which means it's definitely dangerous enough that you shouldn't go alone. Seraphine turned to look at him, and something in her expression shifted. Has anyone ever told you you're impossibly stubborn? Daily, usually by Dutch. Well, he's right. I know. She reached out suddenly, taking his hand. Her grip was tight, desperate. Promise me something. What? If this goes wrong, if Whitmore's people catch up to me, or the lawyers refuse to help, or this whole thing collapses, promise you'll protect those families anyway. Find someone else to take up the fight. Don't let what I started die completely. Seraphine, promise me, Mercer. Please. The desperation in her voice cut through every argument he wanted to make. I promise. But it's not going to come to that. You don't know that. No. But I believe it anyway. She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. All right, then we leave at dawn. Together. And we see this through to whatever end comes. Together, Kate agreed. He left her cabin shortly after, the weight of that promise settling heavy on his shoulders. Back in his own room, sleep still wouldn't come. Instead, he lay awake planning supplies and routes, thinking about what they'd need for a trip to the capital and what dangers might be waiting along the way. Somewhere in the dark hours before dawn, he finally drifted off with one thought circling through his mind. He'd promised to protect Seraphine and finish her fight if she couldn't. But what he hadn't told her was that he had no intention of letting it get that far. Whatever was coming, they'd face it together. And if men like Whitmore wanted to stop them, they'd have to go through every ounce of stubborn determination Cade had spent his whole life cultivating. Morning came cold and clear. Cade woke to find Dutch already organizing supplies for the trip. Dried meat, hardtack, coffee, ammunition. The foreman worked efficiently, not asking questions he already knew the answers to. Garrett and Curtis want to come along, Dutch said when Cade emerged. Told them no, but they're insisting. Why? Because they're bored and stupid. Also because they actually believe in what Seraphine's doing, which amounts to the same thing. We don't need a whole crew. Probably not, but having a few extra guns along might discourage anyone thinking about causing trouble on the road. Cade considered it. The trip to the capital would take 4 days each way, maybe more depending on weather and roads. Having backup wasn't a terrible idea, even if it complicated the logistics. Fine, but just those two. Ranch still needs manning. Already told the others. They're not happy, but they'll manage. Seraphine appeared as they were finishing the preparations, looking more rested than she had the previous night, but still carrying that edge of tension that seemed permanently etched into her posture now. She surveyed the supplies without comment. You packed for 4 people, she observed. Garrett and Curtis are coming. Dutch's orders. She looked at the foreman, who shrugged. Boss agreed. Don't blame me. I could have made this trip alone. Sure, Dutch agreed. And you could have faced Whitmore's riders alone, too. Worked out better with help, though, didn't it? Seraphine's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. You're all insufferable. We try. They left an hour later, 4 riders heading east as the sun climbed above the horizon. Cade noticed Seraphine kept glancing back at the ranch until it disappeared from view, like she was memorizing it or saying goodbye. He wondered which. The first day passed uneventfully. They covered good distance, stopped twice to rest the horses, and made camp that night near a stream that cut through empty grassland. Curtis proved surprisingly good at making coffee that didn't taste like boot leather, which elevated him significantly in everyone's estimation. How long you worked for Mercer? Seraphine asked him while they ate. 3 years. Came out here after my wife died, needed somewhere remote enough I could forget for a while.
Did you? Forget? Not really. But I found work that mattered, which turned out to be more important than forgetting. Garrett snorted. That's too philosophical for this hour. Save the deep thoughts for morning. You got any deep thoughts? Curtis shot back. Sure. I think we should all get paid more. That's not deep, that's just greedy. Can be both.
Seraphine laughed. The first genuine laugh Kate had heard from her in days. The sound loosened something in his chest he hadn't realized was tight. They continued talking as darkness settled completely, trading stories about ranch life and frontier hardships. Nothing profound, just the easy conversation of people who'd survived things together and come out the other side mostly intact. Seraphine participated more than usual, her guard dropping slightly. When they finally turned in, Cade took first watch. He sat at the camp's edge, rifle across his lap, listening to the night. Behind him, the others slept, or tried to. He could hear Garrett snoring, Curtis's occasional mutter, and the complete silence that meant Seraphine was awake too. You don't have to stay up, Cade said quietly without turning around. Can't sleep. Worried? Always. She moved to sit beside him, wrapped in a blanket against the cold. Thinking about what happens when we reach the capital. We find the lawyers, present the evidence, make sure they follow through. And if they won't, then we make them. How? Haven't figured that part out yet. Seraphine pulled the blanket tighter. This would be easier if I knew what I was doing. You've done fine so far. I've stumbled through so far. There's a difference. Most people on the frontier are stumbling through. You're just more honest about it. She smiled faintly. Is that supposed to be comforting? Is it working? Little bit. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Closer, one of the horses stamped and settled. Mercer? Seraphine said eventually. Yeah? Thank you for this. For all of it. You already thanked me. I know, but I meant it more this time. Cade glanced at her. In the starlight, her profile was sharp and tired and determined. Beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with the strength she carried like armor. You're welcome, he said, both times. The rest of the watch passed quietly. When Curtis woke to take over, Cade tried to sleep but found himself listening instead to Seraphine's breathing, wondering what tomorrow would bring and whether they were riding toward victory or just a different kind of defeat. Morning came too soon. They broke camp as the sun crept above the horizon, turning the grassland into a sea of gold and shadow. Cade noticed Seraphine moving slower than usual, favoring her left side. When he asked about it, she waved him off. Slept wrong. It'll work itself out. But it didn't. By midday, she was riding stiffly, jaw tight with pain she refused to acknowledge. Cade exchanged glances with Curtis, who shrugged. They both knew pushing her to rest would accomplish nothing except making her defensive. They stopped at noon near a cluster of cottonwood trees that offered shade and water. While the horses drank, Garrett pulled out the map and traced their route with one finger. We're making good time. Another day and a half, maybe two if we take it easy. We're not taking it easy, Seraphine said, dismounting carefully. Every day we waste is another day. Whitmore's people have to interfere with the filings. Can't interfere much if we're dead from exhaustion, Curtis pointed out. Horses need rest even if you don't. The horses are fine. The horses are tired. So are you. So let's eat, rest an hour, then continue. Seraphine looked like she wanted to argue, but Cade stepped in before she could. An hour. That's reasonable. She glared at him but didn't protest further, which told Cade she was hurting worse than she'd admitted. They settled in the shade, passing around canteens and dried meat. Garrett tried to start a card game, but gave up when nobody showed interest. Cade found Seraphine sitting apart from the group, staring east toward the capital they couldn't yet see. He approached slowly, giving her space to send him away if she wanted. She didn't. You should let Curtis look at whatever's bothering you, he said, settling onto the ground nearby. I'm fine. You're lying. Maybe, but it's my lie to tell. Cade pulled his hat lower against the sun. You know, being tough is useful. Being stupid about injuries is just going to make things worse. It's not an injury. It's an old wound that acts up sometimes. Nothing anyone can do about it. What kind of old wound? Seraphine was quiet for a long moment. Then she lifted her shirt enough to show a scar along her left ribs. Jagged, poorly healed, the kind of mark left by a knife that had barely missed something vital. "From when?" Cade asked quietly. 3 years ago, when they killed my father. One of Whitmore's men tried to make sure I couldn't testify about what I'd seen. Did a decent job of it, too. Would have finished if my father hadn't. She stopped, jaw working. Anyway, sometimes when I'm tired or stressed, it pulls wrong. Reminds me. Cade felt anger rising in his chest. The man who did it? Dead. My father made sure of that before they killed him. Good. Is it? Doesn't bring him back. Doesn't undo what happened. She lowered her shirt, expression distant. Just means one more body in the ground that shouldn't be there. They sat in silence while Cade processed this new piece of her history. It explained some of her intensity, the way she pushed herself past reasonable limits. She wasn't just fighting for justice or those 17 families. She was fighting to make her father's final act mean something. "He'd be proud of you," Cade said eventually, "for what you're doing." "You didn't know him." "No, but I know you. And anyone who raised someone willing to take on men like Whitmore must have done something right." Seraphine's mouth trembled slightly before she controlled it. "He was an idiot. Believed the system would work if you just followed the rules and told the truth. Believed people were basically good." "You don't?" "I think people are basically scared, and scared people do terrible things to protect themselves." "Is that why you're doing this? To prove they don't have to be scared?" "I'm doing this because someone has to. Because those families deserve better than being crushed by men who think power means they can take whatever they want." She looked at him directly. "And maybe because I'm still that idiot's daughter, even after everything, still believing that truth should matter." The vulnerability in her voice caught Cade off guard. For all her toughness and determination, Seraphine was still fighting a battle she wasn't sure she could win, motivated by faith in principles that had already gotten her family killed. "Truth does matter," he said. "Just takes longer than it should to prove it. And if we don't have that long, then we make time." She smiled sadly. "You make it sound simple." "It is simple, just not easy." Garrett called out that the hour was up. They mounted again, Seraphine moving more carefully now, but refusing Curtis's offer to help. The afternoon passed with fewer words than the morning, everyone settling into their own thoughts as the landscape slowly changed around them. Grassland giving way to rolling hills, then to rougher terrain as they approached the territory's interior. That evening, they made camp in a rocky hollow that offered protection from wind and prying eyes. Curtis built a small fire while Garrett tended the horses. Cade noticed Seraphine walking the perimeter with her rifle, checking sightlines and escape routes like she expected trouble to appear at any moment. "She ever relax?" Garrett asked quietly. "Not that I've seen. That's going to wear her down eventually." "I know. So what's the plan when it does?" Cade didn't have an answer for that. The truth was, he'd been so focused on keeping Seraphine alive and moving forward that he hadn't considered what would happen when she finally hit her breaking point. And she would hit it. Everyone did eventually. The question was whether it would happen before or after they reached the capital. After dinner, Seraphine surprised them all by pulling out a harmonica. She played a few notes, testing, then launched into a melody that was somehow both sad and defiant. The music carried across the hollow, competing with wind and distant animal sounds. "Didn't know you played," Cade said. "My mother taught me. Said music was the only thing that couldn't be stolen or taxed or forged." She played another verse. She was wrong about that too, but it's still nice to have. They listened until full dark, when Seraphine finally put the harmonica away and retreated to her bedroll. Cade took first watch again, sitting with his back against a boulder while the others slept. He must have dozed off sometime after midnight because the next thing he knew, Curtis was shaking his shoulder urgently. "Boss, wake up." Cade came alert immediately, hand going to his rifle. "What is it?" "Riders, maybe 6 or 7, coming from the west." Seraphine was already awake, crouched low with her own rifle ready. Garrett had doused the fire, leaving them in near-total darkness. The sound of hoofbeats grew steadily louder. "Could be travelers," Garrett whispered, "just passing through." "At this hour?" Curtis shook his head. "Not likely." The riders slowed as they approached the hollow, then stopped entirely about 50 yards out. Cade could hear voices but couldn't make out words. Then a single rider moved forward, silhouetted against the starlight. "Hello, the camp," the rider called. "We're looking for someone. Woman traveling with some men. You seen anyone like that?" Nobody answered. Cade felt Seraphine tense beside him. "Come on now," the rider continued. "We're not looking for trouble, just information. There's money in it if you've got something useful." "How much money?" Garrett called back before anyone could stop him. Cade shot him a look, but Garrett just shrugged. The rider moved closer, encouraged. "Depends on the information, but we're authorized to pay well for the right answers." "Answers about what?" "About a woman named Sarah Valdez, or Seraphine Vale if she's using that name now. She's wanted for theft and fraud. Dangerous woman. Be doing everyone a favor by turning her in." Cade felt Seraphine's hand on his arm, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. He covered her hand with his own, squeezing gently. "Haven't seen anyone like that," Garrett called. "Just us out here." The rider's horse stamped, impatient. "You sure about that? Because we got word she was traveling this direction with some ranch hands from outside Redemption. That match your situation?" "Lots of ranch hands travel lots of directions. Doesn't mean anything." "Maybe. Or maybe you're protecting her, which would make you accomplices." Curtis spoke up then, voice hard. "And maybe you're harassing innocent travelers in the middle of the night, which would make you bandits. So how about you state your business clearly or move along?" The rider fell silent. Behind him, Cade could sense the other riders shifting, hands probably moving toward weapons. The tension stretched thin as wire. "All right," the rider said finally. "We'll move along. But if I find out you were lying, there'll be consequences." "Same to you if we find out you were threatening," Curtis replied. The riders withdrew slowly, reluctantly. Cade watched them disappear into the darkness, not relaxing until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. "That was close," Garrett breathed. "Too close," Seraphine said. Her hand was still gripping Cade's arm. "They knew about the ranch hands, about Redemption. They're tracking us specifically." "How?" "Pike, maybe. Or someone else in town who talked." "Doesn't matter. Point is, they know we're headed to the capital, and they're trying to intercept us before we get there." Cade stood, mind racing through options. "We need to change our route. Take a longer path that's less predictable." "That'll add days," Curtis said. "Better than running into an ambush on the main road." Seraphine shook her head. "We can't afford days. Every delay gives Whitmore more time to corrupt the process, bribe officials, make the documents disappear. And riding into a trap gives him exactly what he wants. You dead or captured. So what do you suggest?" Cade thought hard. They were still 2 days from the capital on the main route, maybe 3 or 4 if they took back roads. But those riders would be reporting back to someone, probably Whitmore himself, and more people would be dispatched to watch the roads. "We split up," he said finally. "Garrett and Curtis continue on the main route, making noise, being visible. Act like they're the whole group. Meanwhile, you and I take the back trails, faster, harder to track." "That leaves them exposed," Seraphine protested. "They're not the targets. You are. Long as those riders think you're with Garrett and Curtis, they'll focus there." Curtis nodded slowly. "Could work. We lead them on a chase, buy you time to reach the capital." "It's too dangerous," Seraphine said. "So's everything else," Garrett pointed out. "At least this way we're being dangerous strategically." They argued for another 20 minutes, Seraphine insisting she wouldn't let anyone else take risks for her, the others insisting right back that the mission mattered more than individual safety. Finally, Cade cut through the debate. "We're doing this. Garrett, Curtis, you leave at dawn, make sure you're seen. Head toward the capital like nothing's changed. Seraphine and I go now. Take the northern trail through the rougher country. We'll meet you in the capital in 3 days." "And if we run into trouble?" Curtis asked. "Handle it however you need to, just don't mention where we actually went." "That's a lot of trust you're putting in us, boss." "I know, don't make me regret it." They spent the next hour reorganizing supplies, splitting food and ammunition between the two groups. Seraphine worked in tense silence, clearly unhappy with the plan, but unable to offer a better alternative. When everything was ready, she and Cade mounted their horses while the others settled back into the hollow. "Be careful," Curtis said. "That northern route's rough country, easy to get lost." "We'll manage," Cade replied. "You two just focus on making a good show for whoever's watching." "Oh, we'll put on a show," Garrett promised. Might even enjoy it. Cade and Seraphine rode out into the darkness, leaving the hollow behind. For the first hour, they moved slowly, carefully, letting their eyes adjust to starlight and their horses pick their way over uncertain ground. The northern trail was less a trail and more a suggestion, a path used occasionally by hunters and trappers, but not maintained or marked. "This is insane," Seraphine muttered after they'd nearly lost the path for the third time. "We're going to break our necks out here." "Better than having them broken by Whitmore's men." "Is it, though? At least that would be quick." Despite the situation, Cade found himself smiling. "You always this optimistic?" "Only on special occasions." They rode in silence after that, focusing on navigation and trying not to think about how many ways this plan could fail. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed into hill country, the path winding between rocky outcroppings and stands of pine that seemed to absorb what little light the stars provided. Dawn found them high in the hills with no sign of pursuit. They stopped to rest the horses and eat a cold breakfast, neither wanting to risk a fire. Below them, the land spread out in layers of shadow and emerging light. "How much farther?" Seraphine asked. "To the capital? Day and a half if we push, 2 if we're smart about it." "We push." "Seraphine, I know what you're going to say, that I'm running myself into the ground, that I need to pace myself, that exhaustion makes mistakes. But here's the thing, Mercer, I'm already exhausted. Have been since this started. Stopping to rest won't change that. Only finishing will." Cade wanted to argue but recognized the futility. She'd made up her mind, and nothing he said would change it. So instead he nodded and mounted his horse. "Then we push. But if you fall out of the saddle, I'm tying you to it." "Fair." They continued through the morning and into afternoon, the hills gradually flattening as they descended toward the river valley that led to the capital. Twice they spotted riders in the distance and detoured to avoid them. Once they heard gunshots that might have been hunting or might have been something worse. They didn't stop to investigate. By evening, Seraphine was swaying in her saddle, held upright by sheer stubbornness. Cade called a halt near a creek that ran cold and clear from the hills. "We're stopping," he said, leaving no room for argument. "We should keep going. You can barely sit your horse. We stop, we rest, we continue in the morning." For once, she didn't fight him. They made a cold camp again. No fire, just bedrolls and what food they could eat without cooking. Seraphine was asleep almost immediately, curled on her side with one hand still wrapped around her rifle. Cade sat watch, listening to the night and thinking about what would happen when they reached the capital. The lawyers Seraphine had sent documents to were supposedly trustworthy, but lawyers could be bought or intimidated just like anyone else. If Whitmore had gotten to them first, this whole trip might be for nothing. And then what? Did they keep fighting? Find other lawyers, other officials to trust? Or did they finally admit defeat and accept that some battles couldn't be won by determination alone? He didn't have answers, just a bone-deep certainty that walking away wasn't an option anymore. Not for Seraphine, and somehow, not for him either. Morning came gray and cold, threatening rain. They packed quickly and mounted up, both feeling the urgency now. The capital was close, maybe 6 hours away if they didn't run into trouble. They ran into trouble. It was mid-morning when they spotted the roadblock, a fallen tree across the trail, too perfectly placed to be natural. Cade raised his hand, stopping Seraphine, but before they could retreat, riders emerged from the trees on both sides. 8 men, all armed, all looking professional in a way that suggested military training, or worse. Their leader was a square-jawed man with cold eyes who rode forward slowly. "Miss Valdez," he said pleasantly, "you've led us quite a chase." Seraphine's hand moved toward her rifle. The leader shook his head. "I wouldn't. My men have orders to shoot if either of you makes a hostile move, and they're very good at following orders." "What do you want?" Cade asked. "Not you, that's certain. You're just an inconvenience." The leader focused on Seraphine. "The documents, all of them, original and copies. You hand them over now, we let you both ride away." "I don't have them," Seraphine said. "Then you tell us where they are." "Can't do that either," the leader sighed. "I was afraid you'd say that, which means we do this the hard way." He gestured. 2 of his men dismounted and moved toward Seraphine. Cade kicked his horse forward, putting himself between them. "You'll have to go through me." "That can be arranged." The situation was balanced on a knife's edge. Cade knew that any sudden move would end in shooting, and they were badly outnumbered. But letting them take Seraphine meant she'd be tortured for information she'd already distributed to people who would release it if she disappeared. The only leverage she had was staying free and visible. "Wait," Seraphine said suddenly. "I'll tell you where the documents are. But not here. Not with all these guns pointed at us." The leader raised an eyebrow. "You expect me to trust you?" "I expect you to be smart. You kill us here, my contacts release everything, and your entire operation falls apart. But if I cooperate, if I tell you where every copy is located, you can retrieve them quietly. No exposure, no scandal. Everyone wins. Except the families whose land gets stolen. Except them, yes, but I'm tired of fighting, tired of running. If you promise safe passage and enough money to start somewhere new, I'll give you everything." Cade stared at her, trying to understand what she was doing. This couldn't be real. She'd risked everything for those families. She wouldn't just surrender now, unless it was a ploy. The leader seemed to be thinking the same thing. "You understand if you're lying, I'll make sure you regret it before you die." "I understand, but I'm not lying. I'm just done." Silence stretched. Cade could see the leader calculating, weighing the risk of believing her against the potential reward. Finally, he nodded. "All right, we'll do this your way. But my men stay close, and if I sense even a hint of deception, the deal's off." "Fair enough. So where are these documents?" Seraphine looked directly at Cade when she answered. "Split between 3 locations, 2 law offices and 1 newspaper editor, all in the capital. We go there together. I'll take you to each one personally." The capital. She was leading them to the capital, where there would be witnesses, law enforcement, people who could interfere. Cade understood now. She was gambling that once they were in a populated area, the balance of power would shift. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was something. "Lead the way," the leader said. "But remember, my men are excellent shots, even in crowds." They rode in a tight group, surrounded by the armed riders. Cade stayed close to Seraphine, trying to catch her eye, but she kept her gaze forward, face carefully neutral. Whatever plan she had, she wasn't sharing it yet. The trail wound down from the hills into more settled country. They passed farms and homesteads, people working in fields who paused to watch the group ride by. The leader kept his men spread out enough that it wouldn't look immediately suspicious, but tight enough that escape was impossible. By early afternoon, the capital came into view. A sprawling town of perhaps 5,000 people, the largest settlement in 3 territories. It had a real sheriff's office, a courthouse, multiple hotels and saloons, and enough activity that Cade immediately felt more hopeful. Surely in a place this size they could find help. But the leader seemed unconcerned. He directed them toward a less traveled street, avoiding the main thoroughfare where crowds gathered. "First location," he said to Seraphine. "Which law office?" "Brennan and Associates, near the courthouse." "You 2 go in," the leader said, gesturing to Seraphine and Cade. "My men will have eyes on every exit. You try to run or signal for help, people will die. Understood?" "Understood," Seraphine said. They dismounted and entered the law office, a modest building with dusty windows and a clerk who looked up without much interest when they walked in. "Help you?" the clerk asked. "We're here to see Mr. Brennan," Seraphine said. "It's urgent." "He's with a client. You'll have to—" "Now," Seraphine said, her voice carrying an edge that made the clerk blink. "Tell him Sarah Valdez is here about the land fraud documents." The clerk's eyes widened. He disappeared through a back door, returning moments later with a distinguished man in his 50s who looked at Seraphine with obvious recognition. "Miss Valdez, I wasn't expecting to see you in person." "Mr. Brennan, I need to know if the documents I sent are still secure." "Of course. They're exactly where you specified." He glanced at Cade. "Who's this?" "A friend. Can you confirm what evidence you're holding?" Brennan hesitated, clearly sensing something wrong. "That's confidential information. I'd need to verify your identity more thoroughly before—" "There are armed men outside," Seraphine said quietly. "Men who work for the people those documents expose. They forced me here to retrieve everything, but what they don't know is that I'm about to make this very public, very quickly." Brennan's face went pale. "Miss Valdez, if you're under duress—" "I am. Which is why I need you to do exactly as I say. Go to the sheriff's office, tell them what's happening, Tell them there are armed men holding us hostage and trying to steal evidence of massive land fraud. Can you do that? Of course, but no buts. Just go, now, before they realize I'm not actually cooperating. Brennan grabbed his coat and hurried out a back entrance. The clerk stood frozen, clearly terrified. You too, Seraphine told him. Go, spread the word. Tell anyone who'll listen what's happening here. The clerk bolted. Seraphine turned to Cade. That bought us maybe 5 minutes. We need to move. Where? Out the back. Find somewhere public. The more witnesses, the better. They slipped through the back door into an alley. The leader's men were watching the front, giving them a brief window. They ran. Seraphine leading despite her obvious exhaustion, winding through back streets toward the center of town. Behind them, shouts erupted. The leader had realized they'd escaped. There, Seraphine gasped, pointing at a large building ahead. The courthouse. Get inside. They burst through the courthouse doors into a crowded lobby. People turned to stare, conversations dying. A bailiff approached, looking annoyed. You can't just run in here. Those men chasing us are trying to stop a land fraud investigation, Seraphine announced loudly, making sure everyone could hear. They're armed and threatening. Someone get the sheriff. The leader and 2 of his men appeared in the doorway, clearly frustrated but unable to act violently in such a public space. The standoff that followed was tense but bloodless. Too many witnesses, too many people now aware that something serious was happening. Within minutes, the sheriff arrived with deputies. The leader tried to talk his way out, claiming they were simply escorting Seraphine for her protection, but Brennan had already told the authorities what was really happening. The armed men were disarmed and detained, though everyone knew they'd probably be released once their employer's lawyers got involved. Still, it was enough. Seraphine had escaped, the documents were still secure, and now the whole capital knew something important was happening. Cade found her sitting on the courthouse steps afterward, shaking with exhaustion and reaction. He sat beside her, not touching, just present. That was the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever seen, he said. It worked, didn't it? Barely. Barely is enough. They sat in silence while the chaos continued around them. Deputies taking statements, Brennan organizing the evidence, people gathering to gossip about the dramatic scene. Seraphine watched it all with tired eyes. Now comes the hard part, she said quietly. This wasn't the hard part? This was staying alive. Now we have to actually win the case, prove the fraud, get the land returned. That'll take months, maybe years. But you started it. That's what matters. Seraphine looked at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, she seemed close to breaking down completely. I'm so tired, Mercer. I don't know if I can do months or years of this. Then don't do it alone. I don't have a choice. Yes, you do. You could come back to the ranch. Let Brennan and the other lawyers handle the legal battle. Check in periodically, but stop carrying all of it yourself. That's smart, Cade interrupted. You've done everything you can do. The documents are filed. The exposure has started. The families know someone's fighting for them. The rest is lawyers and judges and process. You don't have to be here for every minute of it. Seraphine stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. What would I do at the ranch? Whatever you want. Work with the horses, fix fences, sleep for a week straight. Anything that isn't this. And you'd be okay with that? With me just existing there? Not earning my place? You already earned your place, about 100 times over. She looked away, blinking rapidly. You're too good at this, at making impossible things sound reasonable. It's not impossible. It's just letting other people help carry the weight for a while. They sat until the sheriff came to take formal statements. The process took hours, going over every detail of the kidnapping attempt and the documents and Whitmore's broader operation. By the time they finished, it was dark, and Cade realized neither of them had eaten all day. They found a small restaurant still open and ordered whatever the kitchen had left. The food was mediocre but hot, and Seraphine ate mechanically, barely tasting it. Garrett and Curtis should be arriving tomorrow, Cade said. We'll need to find them, let them know what happened. They're probably worried. Probably, but they can handle themselves. Seraphine pushed food around her plate. Do you think it'll actually work? The legal case against Whitmore and his people? Honestly, I don't know. But I know it has a better chance than it did a week ago, and that's because of you. Because I was stubborn and reckless. Because you cared enough to try when nobody else would.
She met his eyes across the table. Why do you keep doing that? Doing what? Making me sound better than I am. Braver. More important. I'm not making you sound like anything. I'm just seeing what's actually there. Seraphine shook her head slowly. You're going to be disappointed eventually, when you realize I'm just someone who got lucky and angry at the same time. I doubt that.
You shouldn't. I disappoint everyone eventually.
Not everyone, not yet.
They finished eating in silence, then found a small hotel that had rooms available. Cade paid for 2, ignoring Seraphine's weak protest about expenses. She was asleep before he'd even closed her door, still fully dressed, collapsed across the bed like someone who'd been running for years and finally had permission to stop. Cade sat in his own room for a long time, thinking about what came next. The legal battle would be long and complicated. Whitmore had resources and connections that wouldn't disappear just because some documents got filed. But Seraphine had started something that couldn't be easily stopped now. Too many people knew, too many families had hope. Too much light had been shown on operations that relied on darkness. And somehow, in the middle of all that chaos and danger and uncertainty, Cade had found something he'd stopped believing existed. A reason to fight for something bigger than just his own survival. Tomorrow they'd find Garrett and Curtis. Then they'd start the long process of turning documents into justice. And somewhere in all of that, maybe Seraphine would finally believe that she didn't have to carry everything alone. Maybe. Morning brought rain and complications. Cade woke to water hammering against the hotel window and the sound of raised voices from the street below. He dressed quickly and knocked on Seraphine's door. No answer. He tried the handle. Unlocked. The room was empty, bed unmade but clearly slept in. He found her downstairs in the hotel's small dining room, sitting across from Brennan and another man Cade didn't recognize. Both lawyers looked grim. Seraphine's face was pale, her breakfast untouched. "What's wrong?" Cade asked, pulling up a chair. "Everything," Seraphine said flatly. "Tell him, Brennan." The lawyer cleared his throat. "The documents Miss Valdez provided are legitimate and damning. Unfortunately, that's not enough. Whitmore's people filed countersuit this morning claiming the documents were obtained illegally. They're arguing that anything derived from them should be inadmissible in court." "That's insane," Cade said. "They're basically admitting the documents are real by trying to exclude them." "Correct. But legally, it's a valid challenge. If the judge rules in their favor, we lose our primary evidence." "So what do we do?" The second lawyer spoke up. "We need witnesses. People who can testify to the fraud without relying on the stolen documents. Families who were threatened, officials who were approached with bribes. Anyone who can corroborate what the paperwork proves." "How many witnesses?" Seraphine asked. "Ideally, 20 or 30. Minimum, 10. And they'd need to be credible, consistent, and willing to face cross-examination from expensive defense attorneys." "And how do we find these people?" "That's the problem. Most victims are scattered across 3 territories. Many are too scared to come forward. Some have already lost everything and moved away." Seraphine pushed her plate away. "So we're back where we started. Truth isn't enough if people are too afraid to speak it." Brennan leaned forward. "Miss Valdez, I understand your frustration, but this is how the legal system works. We need more than documents. We need voices." "I know, She stopped, jaw tight. "I thought getting the evidence would be the hard part." "It was the first hard part," Brennan corrected gently. "Now comes the next one." They spent the next hour discussing strategy. The lawyers needed time to track down potential witnesses, which meant Seraphine and Cade would be stuck in the capital for weeks, maybe months. The alternative was returning to the ranch and letting the lawyers handle everything, but Seraphine clearly couldn't stomach the idea of walking away now. When the lawyers finally left to file responses to Whitmore's countersuit, Seraphine slumped in her chair. "I can't do this," she said quietly. "Weeks of sitting around waiting for lawyers to find people who probably won't talk. Months of court proceedings where expensive attorneys tear apart everything I tried to build." "So don't," Cade said. She looked at him sharply. "What?" "Don't sit around. Go find the witnesses yourself." "That's their job. They're lawyers. They'll send letters, make inquiries through official channels. By the time they locate someone, that person will have been threatened or bought off or convinced that testifying isn't worth the risk." Cade leaned forward. But you? You lived this. You understand what these families are going through. You can talk to them in ways lawyers never could. That's still weeks of traveling, maybe longer. So we travel, visit the families, hear their stories, convince them to fight back. Brennan and his partner handle the legal strategy while we handle the human part. Seraphine stared at him. You'd come with me? For weeks? Dutch can manage the ranch. This is more important. Why do you keep doing this? Keep volunteering for things that aren't your responsibility? Cade thought about how to answer that. He could say it was about justice or doing what's right, but the truth was simpler and more complicated. Because watching you fight alone feels wrong, he said finally. And because I'm starting to realize this is exactly the kind of thing I should have been doing all along instead of just hiding on my ranch hoping the world wouldn't notice me. Something shifted in Seraphine's expression, surprise mixed with something that might have been hope. You're serious? Completely. It'll be dangerous. Whitmore's people won't just let us wander around convincing witnesses to testify. I know. And there's no guarantee it'll work. We might spend weeks tracking people down only to have them refuse to help. That's possible. So why bother? Because the alternative is giving up. And I don't think either of us knows how to do that anymore. Seraphine almost smiled. You really are impossibly stubborn. Runs in the family. They found Garrett and Curtis later that morning at a saloon on the edge of town, both soaked from the rain and looking worse for wear. Curtis had a black eye, and Garrett was favoring his left arm. What happened to you two? Cade asked, joining them at a back table. Led those riders on a merry chase, Garrett said, grinning despite the obvious pain. Worked too well. They figured out eventually we were decoys and got angry about it. How angry? Broke my arm angry, Curtis said, gesturing to his eye. Got a few good hits in myself, though. Seraphine looked stricken. This is my fault. Hell it is, Curtis replied. This was our choice. We knew what we were signing up for. Still nothing. You got the documents filed, you exposed the fraud, you're making things happen. That's worth a black eye and some bruised ribs. And a broken arm, Garrett added cheerfully. Don't forget my broken arm. How could I when you won't shut up about it, Curtis muttered. Despite everything, Seraphine laughed. The sound was tired but genuine, and Cade felt some of his own tension ease. They were battered and exhausted, but they were still fighting, still together. They spent the afternoon planning. Brennan provided a list of 17 families affected by the land fraud, along with rough locations and what little information he'd been able to gather about their current situations. Some had already lost their land and relocated. Others were still fighting through legal channels. A few had simply disappeared, defeated by the system they'd trusted to protect them. We start with the closest ones, Cade suggested, spreading a map across the table. Work our way out in a rough circle. That way we're not backtracking constantly. Should take 3 weeks if we're efficient, Seraphine said, studying the locations. Longer if people are hard to find or if we run into trouble. When we run into trouble, Curtis corrected, Whitmore's not going to let this happen without interference. Can't be helped. We'll just have to move carefully. Garrett raised his good hand. What about us? Curtis and I aren't exactly subtle. You go back to the ranch, Cade said. Tell Dutch what's happening and that we'll be gone longer than expected. Make sure everything's still standing. That's boring. That's necessary. Someone needs to maintain the base while we're gone. Curtis nodded, accepting this. Garrett looked disappointed but didn't argue. They'd done their part, and nobody could ask more than that. The next morning, Cade and Seraphine left the capital under gray skies that threatened more rain. Their first destination was a small homestead about 50 miles west, owned by a family named Morrison who'd supposedly been forced off their land 6 months earlier. Brennan's notes indicated they'd relocated to a cousin's property, but might be willing to testify if approached correctly. The ride was quiet at first, both of them lost in thought. Then Seraphine spoke. This is probably a terrible idea. Most of what we've done has been terrible ideas. Why stop now? I'm serious. We're about to spend weeks visiting traumatized families and asking them to relive the worst experiences of their lives. Some will say no. Some will blame us for making them hope. Some might report us to Whitmore's people just to make us go away. And some will say yes, Cade said. Some will be grateful someone finally cares enough to listen. You have a lot of faith in people.
Not really, but I have faith in you. That counts for something. Seraphine was quiet for a long moment. What happens if this works? If we get enough witnesses and win the case, and those families actually get their land back? Then they get their land back. Isn't that the goal? I mean, after that, what happens to us?
The question caught Cade off guard. He'd been so focused on the immediate challenges that he hadn't thought about what came after victory. If victory even came. I guess we figure that out when we get there, he said finally. That's not much of a plan. No, but it's honest. They reached the Morrison property by late afternoon. It was a sorry sight, a drafty cabin on rocky land that clearly wasn't suitable for farming or ranching. A woman in her 40s was hanging laundry when they rode up, 3 children playing nearby. Mrs. Morrison? Seraphine called, dismounting carefully. The woman turned, instantly wary. Who's asking? My name is Seraphine Vale. I'm working with lawyers in the capital on the land fraud cases. I was hoping to talk to you and your husband about what happened to your property. Mrs. Morrison's face hardened. We already lost everything. Don't see how talking about it helps anyone. It helps if you're willing to testify. We're building a case against the people who stole your land. If we get enough witnesses for what? A trial? You think a judge is going to side with us over wealthy men with expensive lawyers? She shook her head. We already tried fighting, nearly got killed for it. So no, we're not interested in being witnesses to anything except how broken the system is. Mrs. Morrison, please. I said no. Now get off this property before I get my husband and his shotgun. They left. Seraphine didn't speak for the next 5 miles. Her jaw set in that way Cade recognized as barely contained fury or despair, or both. That's one, she said finally. 16 more chances to get rejected. Or 16 more chances to find someone brave enough to fight back. Same thing, really. The second family was more receptive. The Chens had lost a profitable ranch to forged claims and were living in a cramped apartment above a general store, both parents working menial jobs to support 4 children. When Seraphine explained what she was trying to do, Mr. Chen listened carefully. How many other families are willing to testify? He asked. We're still gathering witnesses, Seraphine admitted. You'd be among the first. So we take all the risk of going first, make ourselves targets, and might end up with nothing if nobody else comes forward? Yes, that's exactly the situation. Mr. Chen appreciated the honesty. I need to discuss this with my wife. Can you come back tomorrow? They found a small boarding house and returned the next morning. The Chens were waiting, both looking tired but determined. We'll testify, Mrs. Chen said, not because we think it'll work, but because our children need to see us fight, even when we're scared. Seraphine's eyes shone. Thank you. I promise we'll do everything we can to protect you during the process. Don't make promises you can't keep, Mr. Chen said gently. Just make sure our story gets told. That's enough. They spent an hour taking detailed notes about the Chen family's experience, the threats they'd received, the forged documents they'd been shown, the officials who'd refused to help. By the time they left, Cade felt both hopeful and furious. The Chens had done nothing wrong except own valuable land that someone else wanted. Over the next 2 weeks, they visited 11 more families. 4 agreed to testify. 3 refused outright. 2 had moved away and couldn't be located. One family's father had died from injuries sustained during a confrontation with Whitmore's men, and the widow was too broken to face a courtroom. The last family simply wasn't home when they arrived, and neighbors said they'd left suddenly in the middle of the night. 6 witnesses total, including the Chens. Not as many as Brennan wanted, but more than Cade had feared they'd find. They were visiting the 14th family when trouble finally caught up to them. The Reeves family lived on a struggling farm in the Eastern Territory, barely holding on to land that Whitmore's people hadn't yet managed to steal. Mrs. Reeves was suspicious, but willing to talk, inviting them inside for coffee while her husband worked in the distant fields. They'd been there maybe 20 minutes when Cade heard horses approaching fast. He moved to the window and saw 5 riders, all armed, all wearing the kind of hard expressions that meant violence was coming. "Back door," he said sharply. "Now!" They ran, Mrs. Reeves included. But the riders had anticipated this, and 2 men were already covering the rear exit. Cade and Seraphine found themselves trapped in the narrow hallway with Mrs. Reeves between them and the approaching riders.
Miss Valdez, one of the men called through the front door. We're not here to hurt anyone, just want to have a conversation. Then why the guns? Seraphine called back. Insurance. You've been making quite a nuisance of yourself, talking to people who should have learned to keep quiet. Those people have rights, including the right to tell the truth. Rights don't mean much against a bullet. You should have learned that by now. Cade was calculating odds and not liking what he found. 5 men, probably experienced fighters, against himself, Seraphine, and a terrified woman who'd done nothing except offer them coffee. The rifles in their saddlebags were outside with the horses, useless. Cade's sidearm held 6 rounds, Seraphine's 5. Not enough. What do you want? Cade asked. You to stop convincing people to testify. This case dies quietly, everyone moves on, life continues. And if we refuse? Then Mrs. Reeves here becomes an object lesson in what happens to people who help you. Mrs. Reeves made a small, terrified sound. Seraphine's hand tightened on her own pistol. Don't, Cade said quietly to her. 5 against 2, they'll kill us before we fire twice. So what? We just surrender? We negotiate. He raised his voice. All right, let Mrs. Reeves go. She's not part of this. We'll come out, talk, figure something out. Cade, trust me, he said under his breath. The lead writer considered this. Mrs. Reeves leaves first, goes to get her husband from the fields. Then you two come out, slowly, guns on the ground. Deal. Mrs. Reeves fled through the back door. They heard her calling for her husband, voice high with panic. The writers waited patiently. Your turn, the leader said. Cade and Seraphine set their pistols down carefully and stepped outside into weak afternoon sunlight. The writers had them covered from multiple angles, professional and efficient. So, the leader said, dismounting, let's have that conversation. What followed was less conversation and more threat. The leader, a man named Sykes, who'd apparently worked for Whitmore for years, laid out exactly what would happen if they continued gathering witnesses. People would die. Families would lose more than just land. The legal case would fall apart not because of lack of evidence, but because witnesses would mysteriously disappear or change their testimony. You're fighting a war you can't win, Sykes said. Whitmore has money, connections, patience. What do you have? Some stolen documents and a few scared families? That's nothing. It's more than he had to worry about before I started, Seraphine said. True, which is why he wants this handled. So here's the offer. You drop the case, convince the witnesses to back out, and everyone lives. You get paid enough to start somewhere new. The families keep what they haven't lost yet. Clean slate. Except for the families who already lost everything. Can't change the past. Only the future. The future where Whitmore keeps stealing and nobody stops him? Sykes shrugged. The future where everyone lives. Seems like a fair trade. Cade watched Seraphine's face. Saw the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was weighing the offer not because she wanted to accept, but because she was trying to figure out how to escape this without getting them both killed. We'll think about it, Cade said before she could answer. Think fast. You've got until tomorrow. After that, things get uglier. Tomorrow, Cade agreed. Sykes remounted. Smart choice. Be smarter and take the deal. They rode off, leaving Cade and Seraphine standing in the yard with their useless guns and the weight of an impossible decision. Mr. Reeves appeared from the fields, running hard with his wife. What happened? Martha said there were men. Chaet. It's over, Cade said. They're gone. For now. Who were they? People who want us to stop helping families like yours. Reeves looked between them, understanding dawning. This is about the land fraud, about testifying. Yes. And they threatened you. Yes. Reeves was quiet for a moment, then he straightened. We'll testify. My wife and I. Whatever you need. Mr. Reeves, they just made it clear. I don't care what they made clear. I'm tired of being scared, tired of letting powerful men decide what I can and can't do. So we'll testify. And if that makes us targets, then at least we went down fighting. Seraphine looked like she might cry. You understand what you're risking? Better than you think. My grandfather lost everything because he was too afraid to fight. I won't make the same mistake. They stayed with the Reeves family that night, partly because it was getting dark
and partly because strength in numbers seemed important. Over dinner, the Reeves told their story, how Whitmore's men had shown up with forged claims, how local officials had refused to help, how they'd nearly lost everything before selling off enough land to satisfy the false claims while keeping their core homestead. "It's not right," Mr. Reeves said, "and somebody needs to say so publicly." That night, Cade found Seraphine outside looking at the stars. She didn't acknowledge his presence immediately, just kept staring upward. "7 families willing to testify," she said finally. "That's counting the Reeves. Is it enough?" Brennan said 10 minimum. "So we need 3 more. If we can even find them. If Sykes doesn't make good on his threats first. We'll find them." "You don't know that." "No, but I know we're not taking his offer, and I know you're not giving up. So we keep going until we have enough witnesses or run out of families to ask." Seraphine finally looked at him. What he said about Whitmore having patience. He's right. We're running on exhaustion and borrowed time. Eventually something's going to break. Then we make sure it's not us. How? Cade didn't have a good answer, just faith that somehow they'd figure it out, the same way they'd figured out everything else so far. It wasn't much, but standing there under stars that didn't care about fraud or justice or human suffering, it was all they had. They left the Reeves farm at dawn, adding another name to their list. 3 more families to visit, 3 more chances to reach the minimum Brennan needed. The next family, the Delgados, lived 2 days' ride south, former ranchers who'd been forced into tenant farming on land they'd once owned. The journey was tense. Every rider they passed might be working for Whitmore. Every town they skirted might have eyes watching for them. Sykes's deadline came and went without consequence, which somehow made things worse. The threat still hung over them, just delayed. The Delgados proved difficult. The mother wanted to testify. The father absolutely refused. They argued in Spanish, rapid enough that Cade couldn't follow, voices rising and falling with passion. Finally, Mrs. Delgado turned to Seraphine. "I will testify with or without my husband's permission, but I need your promise that if something happens to me, someone will take care of my children." "I promise," Seraphine said without hesitation. "Don't make promises for me," Cade said quietly. "Too late. I already did." Mr. Delgado threw up his hands and stormed out. His wife watched him go with resignation. "He is scared. He has reasons, but I am tired of fear winning." 8 witnesses. The 16th family, the Kowalskis, said no immediately and slammed the door before Seraphine could finish explaining. The 17th family had moved east to the coast, too far to pursue in the time they had left. 8 witnesses total, 2 short of minimum. Brennan would work with what they had, but the case would be weaker, more vulnerable to Whitmore's attorneys. They returned to the capital 3 weeks after leaving, exhausted and defeated despite their partial success. Brennan met them at his office with more bad news. "Whitmore's people got to 2 of your witnesses, bribed them to recant their statements." "Which 2? Seraphine asked, voice hollow. "The Chens and another family, I'm sorry. We're down to 6 confirmed witnesses." "So we lost. We're losing. There's a difference, but yes, without more witnesses or stronger evidence, the judge will likely rule in Whitmore's favor." Seraphine sat down heavily. 3 weeks. We spent 3 weeks convincing people to fight, and it still isn't enough. "It might be enough to create pressure," Brennan said. "The newspapers are covering this now. People are paying attention. Even if we lose in court, the exposure might force territorial governors to investigate." "Might. That's a weak word." "It's the only one I have right now." Cade watched Seraphine's face as she processed this. She'd given everything, her safety, her peace, her last reserves of energy. And the system was still going to fail her. Fail the families she'd tried to protect. "There has to be something else," Cade said. "Another angle we haven't tried." "Like what?" Brennan asked. "I don't know, but I refuse to believe we've exhausted every option." "Sometimes exhaustion is all there is," Seraphine said quietly. "Sometimes you fight as hard as you can and still lose." "Not yet. We're not at yet. She looked at him with tired eyes. "When do we reach yet?" "When we've actually tried everything instead of just most things." Brennan cleared his throat. "There is one possibility. Extremely risky, probably illegal, definitely dangerous." "We're listening," Cade said.
The judge hearing the case, Judge Morrison, has a reputation for integrity, but he's also human, susceptible to pressure. If we could prove that Whitmore has been bribing officials, threatening judges, corrupting the system itself, Morrison might rule more favorably even with weak witness testimony. How do we prove that? By getting someone close to Whitmore to turn, someone with direct knowledge of bribes and threats, someone willing to testify in exchange for immunity. Seraphine straightened slightly. You're talking about getting one of his own people to betray him. Yes. That's impossible. Anyone close to Whitmore is either too loyal or too scared. Not everyone, Brendan said carefully. There's a man named Douglas Pierce. He's Whitmore's bookkeeper, handles all the financial transactions, including the illegal ones. Word is he's getting nervous about exposure, worried about going down with Whitmore if this case falls apart. So he might be willing to deal. Possibly, if approached correctly, if offered sufficient protection and immunity. Cade felt hope stirring. How do we approach him? Very carefully. Pierce is watched constantly. Any obvious contact would be reported immediately. You'd need to find him somewhere private, convince him quickly, and get him somewhere safe before Whitmore realizes what's happening. Where does Pierce live? Here in the capital. Has an apartment above a bookshop on 3rd Street. But like I said, he's watched. Seraphine stood. Then we'll be careful. Miss Valdez, this is dangerous in ways the witness gathering wasn't. If Whitmore discovers what you're attempting, I know, but we're out of other options, so we try this. Brennan looked at Cade. Can you talk sense into her? Never could before. Don't see why that would change now. The lawyer sighed. Then I'll prepare immunity documents, just in case you actually manage this. They spent that afternoon planning. Pierce's apartment was on a busy street with multiple watchers reported at various points. The direct approach wouldn't work. They needed something subtler. Fire, Cade said suddenly. Seraphine looked at him. What? We start a small fire. Nothing dangerous, just enough smoke to trigger evacuation. In the chaos, we grab Pierce and convince him to come with us. That's insane. You have a better idea? She didn't. So that night they found themselves in an alley behind the bookshop, watching Pierce's window and waiting for the right moment. Cade had prepared a smoke device, oil-soaked rags in a metal bucket that would produce impressive smoke without actual flames. At midnight, when the street was finally quiet, Cade lit the device and placed it near the bookshop's back door. Within minutes, smoke was billowing impressively. Someone shouted. Then more voices. The evacuation happened faster than expected, people streaming from buildings in nightclothes, confused and alarmed. Pierce appeared, coughing, wrapped in a robe. Seraphine stepped from the shadows. Mr. Pierce, we need to talk. He nearly ran. Cade blocked the path. We're not here to hurt you. We're here to offer you a way out. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. You keep Whitmore's books. You know exactly how many bribes he's paid, how many officials he's corrupted, how many threats he's made. And you're terrified that when this falls apart, you'll take the blame. Pierce's face went pale. I can't talk to you. If he finds out, he'll kill you? Maybe. Or maybe you testify against him, get full immunity, and start somewhere new where powerful criminals don't control your life. I have family. He'll go after them. We can protect them. Put them in federal custody. Relocate them. Make sure Whitmore never finds them. You can't promise that. No, Seraphine said. But we can try, which is more than you have now. Pierce looked between them, visibly shaking. Around them, people were still evacuating, too focused on the smoke to notice their quiet conversation. What would I have to testify about? He asked finally. Everything. Names, dates, amounts. Every illegal transaction you recorded. Everything that proves Whitmore's been corrupting the system. He'll ruin me. He's already ruined you. This is your chance to fight back. Pierce was quiet for a long moment, staring at the smoke-filled street. Then he nodded once, sharp and decisive. I'll do it. But we leave tonight, right now, before he realizes what's happening. They didn't argue. Within an hour, Pierce was hidden in a safe house arranged by Brennan, surrounded by documents he'd grabbed from his apartment before they fled. The bookkeeper spent all night writing out detailed testimony about Whitmore's operation. Bribes paid, officials corrupted, threats made, families destroyed. By morning, they had everything they needed.
Pierce's testimony filled in gaps the stolen documents couldn't cover. It named names, provided dates, connected dots that made Whitmore's entire operation visible and prosecutable. Brennan reviewed the testimony with something like awe. This is extraordinary. With this and your witnesses, we actually have a chance. A chance isn't a guarantee, Seraphine said. No, but it's better than what we had yesterday. The trial was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Whitmore's attorneys tried every delay tactic imaginable, but Judge Morrison was true to his reputation for integrity. The case would proceed. Those 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Witnesses were briefed, testimony refined, arguments constructed. Cade watched Seraphine throw herself into the work with renewed intensity, as if afraid that stopping would mean confronting how close they'd come to failure. The night before the trial, she finally broke down. Cade found her in the boarding house's small garden, crying silently in the dark. "Hey," he said, sitting beside her. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's perfect. We have witnesses, we have Pierce's testimony, we have a real chance." She wiped at her eyes angrily. "So why do I feel like I'm about to lose everything that matters?" "Because you're terrified. That's normal." "It doesn't feel normal. It feels like drowning." Cade put his arm around her and she leaned into him, still crying. They sat like that for a long time, not talking, just being present while Seraphine finally let herself feel the fear and exhaustion she'd been suppressing for weeks. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Cade said eventually, "you've already won something important. You made people believe change was possible. That matters." "Does it? If the judge rules against us, those families still lose everything." "Maybe, but they'll know someone tried. Someone cared enough to fight even when the odds were terrible. That's not nothing." Seraphine pulled back, looking at him. "When did you become so optimistic?" "Since I met someone too stubborn to quit even when she should." She laughed, watery and tired. "You're talking about yourself, right?" "Definitely talking about you." They sat until the stars came out, neither wanting to face tomorrow, but knowing they had no choice. Finally, Seraphine stood, offering her hand to help Cade up. "Thank you," she said. "For all of it. For believing when I couldn't. That's what partners do. Are we partners?" "Seems like it, unless you've got a better word." "No," Seraphine said softly. "Partners works just fine." They walked back inside together, ready or not for whatever morning would bring. The courthouse was packed by 8 in the morning. Cade had never seen so many people crammed into one space, all of them drawn by news of the trial that had been building for weeks. Families who'd lost land, journalists from 3 territories, locals who just wanted to witness something important. The air was thick with tension and body heat, despite the morning chill outside. Seraphine sat at the plaintiff's table beside Brennan, looking small but composed in borrowed formal clothes that didn't quite fit. Across the aisle, Whitmore's defense team occupied their space like an occupying army. 4 expensive attorneys in tailored suits, assistants carrying stacks of documents, and Whitmore himself sitting calm and confident like a man who'd never lost anything in his life. Cade found a seat in the back where he could see everything. Curtis and Garrett had arrived the night before and sat a few rows ahead, Curtis's black eye now faded to yellow-green. Dutch had sent a telegram wishing them luck and promising the ranch was still standing, which was about as sentimental as the foreman got. Judge Morrison entered, and the room stood. He was older than Cade expected, maybe 70, with white hair and eyes that missed nothing. His reputation for integrity was either their salvation or meant nothing at all, depending on whether that integrity could withstand the pressure Whitmore would bring to bear. "Be seated," Morrison said, his voice carrying despite not being loud. "We're here regarding the matter of 17 families versus Harrison Whitmore and associated parties, claims of land fraud through forged documentation and intimidation. Counselors, are we ready to proceed?" Brennan stood. "We are, Your Honor." The lead defense attorney, a man named Carrington, who looked like he charged by the word, also stood. "Ready, Your Honor. Though we maintain these proceedings are based on illegally obtained evidence and should be dismissed. We've already ruled on admissibility, Mr. Carrington. The trial proceeds. Opening statements, please." What followed was 3 hours of legal maneuvering that made Cade's head hurt. Brennan laid out the case methodically. Forged documents, intimidation tactics, bribed officials, Systematic theft from families who couldn't fight back. He referenced the stolen documents, explained how Seraphine had obtained them, and argued that the ends justified the means when the system itself was corrupted. Carrington countered with charm and misdirection, painting Whitmore as a legitimate businessman caught in the crossfire of vindictive accusations by people who'd made poor financial decisions and now wanted someone to blame. He questioned the reliability of documents obtained through theft. He suggested the witnesses would be shown to have ulterior motives. He made it sound almost reasonable. By lunch recess, Cade couldn't tell which way the judge was leaning. Morrison's face gave nothing away. They ate at a small restaurant 2 blocks from the courthouse, Seraphine pushing food around her plate without eating. "You need to eat something," Cade said. "Can't. My stomach feels like it's trying to escape through my throat." "That's just nerves." "Nerves that are probably right. Did you see Whitmore's face? He looked like he'd already won." "He always looks like that. Doesn't mean anything." Brennan joined them, looking tired but determined. Afternoon session starts with witness testimony. We're leading with Mrs. Chen since she's the most composed, then Reeves, then Delgado. Pierce testifies tomorrow if we get that far. "If?" Seraphine asked. "Carrington's going to try discrediting the witnesses before we reach Pierce. If he succeeds, Morrison might rule without hearing the bookkeeper's testimony." "Can he do that?" "He's the judge. He can do whatever he thinks serves justice." The afternoon was brutal. Mrs. Chen testified clearly and calmly about how Whitmore's men had threatened her family, shown forged claims to their ranch, and made it clear that resistance would be met with violence. She was credible and sympathetic, and Cade thought they were winning until Carrington began his cross-examination. The attorney was surgical. He questioned her memory of specific dates, pointed out inconsistencies in her written statement versus her testimony, suggested that financial difficulties might have motivated her to join a lawsuit against a wealthy man. By the time he finished, doubt had been planted. Reeves did better. He was angrier, less polished, but his raw emotion seemed genuine. When Carrington tried the same tactics, Reeves pushed back. "You're suggesting I'm lying for money?" Reeves said, voice rising. "I lost my land because your client hired thugs to forge documents. That's not a memory problem. That's theft." "Mr. Reeves, please keep your voice down," Morrison said mildly. "Why? So we can pretend this is civilized? My grandfather fought for that land. I worked it my whole life. And these people took it with fake paperwork and threats. So no, I won't keep my voice down about that." The outburst probably hurt them legally, but Cade saw several people in the gallery nodding. Whatever Reeves lacked in composure, he made up for in conviction. Mrs. Delgado testified last, speaking through a translator despite her decent English. Her story matched the others. Threats, forged documents, officials who refused to help. Carrington tried to shake her, but she held firm. By the time court adjourned for the day, they'd gotten through 3 witnesses. 3 more scheduled for tomorrow, then Pierce. 7 days of testimony, according to Brennan's estimate, before closing arguments. That evening, Cade found Seraphine on the hotel roof, a space she'd discovered that offered a view of the Capitol's scattered lights. "You're going to fall off that ledge," he said, approaching carefully. "Probably. Might be better than sitting through another day of watching our witnesses get torn apart." "They're holding up well. Carrington's making them look unreliable. You saw the jury's faces." "There is no jury, just Morrison. Same principle. He's one man trying to decide who's telling the truth, and Carrington's very good at creating doubt." Cade sat on the ledge beside her, less close to the edge. "You know what I realized today?" "What?" "We've already won something that can't be taken away." Seraphine looked at him skeptically. "What's that?" "We made this public. Before you started, these families were being crushed quietly, one at a time, with nobody paying attention. Now, every newspaper in 3 territories is covering this trial. People are talking. Even if Morrison rules against us, Whitmore's operation is exposed. He can't work in the shadows anymore." "That's not the same as justice." "No, but it's not nothing either." She was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say that exposure was the best disinfectant, that once people knew about corruption, they'd demand change." "What happened to him?" "He was murdered before enough people listened." She smiled sadly. "Turns out exposure only works if you survive long enough for it to matter. You're still here. For now. For as long as it takes." Seraphine reached over and took his hand.
You know what scares me most? Not losing the case, not even what Whitmore might do if we win. It's the idea that after all this, nothing fundamental changes, that we fight and suffer and risk everything, and the system just absorbs it and continues crushing the next group of families.
Cade squeezed her hand. Maybe. But maybe some fights are worth having even if you don't win completely. Maybe trying matters more than succeeding. That's a depressing philosophy. It's a realistic one, and it's kept me going through a lot of hard things. They sat in silence, watching the Capitol's lights, neither wanting to face tomorrow but knowing they'd do it anyway because the alternative was giving up. And neither of them knew how to do that anymore. The next 3 days were worse. The remaining witnesses testified, and Carrington systematically attacked each one, not with obvious aggression, but with subtle questions that made their memories seem unreliable, their motivations questionable, their stories potentially exaggerated. By the time Pierce took the stand on the 4th day, Cade could feel the case slipping away. But Pierce was different. He wasn't a victim claiming harm. He was an insider confirming the crime. When Brennan asked him to explain his role in Whitmore's organization, Pierce spoke clearly and precisely. I kept the books, all of them, the legitimate business accounts and the ones that tracked illegal activities, bribes paid to county clerks, payments to men who threatened families, fees for forging documents, everything. And you kept records of these illegal transactions? Mr. Whitmore insisted on it. He wanted to know exactly where every dollar went. Why would he document illegal activities? Control. If everyone involved knew he had records of their participation, they couldn't betray him without exposing themselves. But you're betraying him now. Pierce's voice hardened. Because I realized I was complicit in destroying people's lives. And because I knew eventually he'd dispose of me the same way he disposed of anyone who became inconvenient. Carrington's cross-examination was aggressive. He painted Pierce as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, a criminal trying to avoid prosecution, an unreliable witness with everything to gain from lying. But Pierce didn't break. He answered every question with the same detailed precision, and when Carrington pushed too hard, Pierce pushed back. You're suggesting I'm fabricating everything? Pierce asked. I brought documentation, ledgers, receipts, correspondence, physical evidence of every bribe and threat I've described. Unless you're claiming I forged all of that, perhaps you did. Then request a handwriting analysis. Examine the dates and paper. You'll find everything authentic because I'm telling the truth. The documentation was entered as evidence. Brennan had copies distributed. Cade watched Whitmore's face as his own bookkeeper's records were laid bare, and for the first time, the man looked worried. The prosecution rested the next day. Whitmore's defense took 2 more days, calling character witnesses who swore he was an honest businessman, experts who questioned the document authenticity, officials who claimed they'd never been bribed. It was polished and professional and almost convincing. But Cade noticed something during closing arguments. When Carrington painted his client as a victim of malicious prosecution, several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. When he suggested the families had brought their problems on themselves through poor decisions, someone in the back actually scoffed. The narrative Whitmore's team was selling wasn't landing the way it should. Judge Morrison took 3 days to reach a verdict. 3 days where Seraphine barely slept, barely ate, paced the hotel room until Cade thought she'd wear a path in the floor. Brennan tried to project confidence but looked nearly as anxious. The waiting was worse than the trial itself. On the 3rd day, they were summoned back to court. The gallery was packed again, people standing along the walls because every seat was full. Cade found his usual spot in the back, watching Seraphine take her place at the plaintiff's table. She looked fragile and fierce simultaneously, like glass that refused to shatter. Morrison entered, and everyone stood. When they sat again, the silence was absolute. I've reviewed all testimony and evidence presented, Morrison began. This case required me to weigh competing claims about document authenticity, witness credibility, and the fundamental question of whether systematic fraud occurred or whether we're seeing a series of unfortunate business disputes. Cade felt his heart hammering. Seraphine was perfectly still. The defense argued that the plaintiff obtained evidence illegally and therefore all claims should be dismissed, Morrison continued. I find this argument unpersuasive. While the methods used were irregular, the evidence itself is authentic. Mr. Pierce's testimony, corroborated by documentary evidence from Mr. Whitmore's own records, demonstrates a pattern of illegal activity that cannot be ignored. Relief started building in Cade's chest, but Morrison wasn't finished. However, the defense also raised legitimate concerns about witness reliability. Several testimonies contained inconsistencies. Memories that were certain in depositions became uncertain under cross-examination. This is normal, but it weakens the overall case. The relief died. Seraphine's shoulders tightened. Nevertheless, Morrison said, and the word hung heavy in the courtroom, the combination of Pierce's detailed testimony, the documentary evidence, and the consistent pattern across multiple witness accounts convinces me that fraud did occur. Systematic, intentional fraud designed to separate families from their legal property. Someone in the gallery made a small sound. Morrison ignored it. Therefore, I rule in favor of the plaintiffs. The land claims based on forged documentation are hereby declared invalid. Original property rights are restored to the 17 families represented in this case. Mr. Whitmore and associated parties are ordered to return all property obtained through fraudulent means within 90 days and are subject to criminal investigation for their actions. The courtroom erupted. People were shouting, crying, embracing. Seraphine sat frozen, like she couldn't process what she'd just heard. Brennan was shaking her shoulder, saying something Cade couldn't hear over the noise. Morrison banged his gavel repeatedly. Order, we're not finished. The room quieted slightly. Additionally, Morrison said, his voice carrying steel now, this case has exposed corruption extending beyond Mr. Whitmore's organization. Several officials accepted bribes. Multiple county clerks participated in document forgery. A complete investigation will be conducted, and criminal charges will be filed where warranted. He looked directly at Seraphine. Miss Valdez, what you did was illegal. You stole documents and took the law into your own hands. Under normal circumstances, you would face charges. Seraphine stood, swaying slightly. I understand, Your Honor. However, these were not normal circumstances. You exposed fraud that the system failed to prevent or punish. While I cannot condone your methods, I recognize that without them, these families would have received no justice at all. Therefore, I am declining to pursue charges against you. Consider yourself fortunate and don't do it again. Yes, Your Honor. Thank you, Your Honor. Morrison banged his gavel one final time. We're adjourned. The chaos resumed immediately. Cade pushed through the crowd toward Seraphine, who was surrounded by crying families thanking her, journalists demanding statements, people who just wanted to touch someone who'd won against impossible odds. He finally reached her side. You did it. She looked at him, eyes wide and disbelieving. We did it. No, this was you, from the beginning. I couldn't have... Her voice broke. I can't believe it actually worked. Believe it. They were swept up in the celebration, pulled in different directions by people wanting to talk, to thank, to understand how this impossible thing had happened. Cade lost track of Seraphine in the crowd and finally gave up trying to reach her, content to watch from a distance as she was surrounded by the families she'd saved. Later that evening, after the chaos finally died down and most people had drifted away to celebrate privately, Cade found Seraphine alone in a small park near the courthouse. She was sitting on a bench, still in her borrowed formal clothes, looking exhausted and peaceful simultaneously. Mine company? He asked. Depends on the company. He sat beside her. How does it feel? Surreal. Like I'm going to wake up and discover Morrison actually ruled against us, and I just imagined the victory. It's real. 17 families get their land back because you refused to accept that stealing from powerless people was just how things worked. Seraphine was quiet for a long moment. You know what's strange? I thought winning would feel more complete. But I keep thinking about all the families we didn't help. The ones who lost everything before I started, or who were too scared to testify, or who we never found. You can't save everyone. I know. But it doesn't stop me from wishing I could. That's what makes you different. Most people stop caring once their own problems are solved. You care even when it costs you. She looked at him. Is that a compliment or an observation about my poor life choices? Both, probably. They sat watching dusk settle over the Capitol, neither speaking for a while. Finally, Seraphine broke the silence. What happens now? We go back to the ranch and I just... What? Pretend to be a normal person? Is that what you want? I don't know what I want. For 3 years, my whole life has been about this fight, about getting justice for my father, for my family, for everyone Whitmore hurt. And now that it's done, I feel like I lost my purpose. Cade understood that feeling. He'd felt it himself years ago, after his sister's death, when the anger that had driven him finally burned out and left only ash. Maybe purpose isn't one big thing you achieve and then it's over, he said slowly. Maybe it's a series of smaller things, choices you make every day about what matters and how you want to live. That sounds exhausting. It is, but it's also how life works. At least, how it's worked for me. Seraphine leaned against him, tired but solid. The ranch offer still stands. I can just exist there for a while without having to be fighting or running or saving anyone. It stands. Though I should warn you, the black gelding misses you. He's been impossible since you left. I find that very hard to believe. Ask Dutch. He'll back me up. Dutch would back you up if you said the sky was green. True. But in this case, I'm actually telling the truth. She smiled, and Cade realized it was the first genuine, unguarded smile he'd seen from her since the trial started. Maybe since he'd met her. All right, she said. I'll come back to the ranch, at least for a while. Figure out what comes next. No pressure on the figuring out part. You've earned some time to just exist. Have I? Or have I just earned the right to a different set of problems? That's too philosophical for this hour. You sound like Garrett. I'll take that as an insult. They stayed in the park until stars appeared, talking about nothing important, avoiding all the heavy topics that would need addressing eventually. When they finally walked back toward the hotel, Cade noticed Seraphine moving easier, like some weight she'd been carrying had finally lifted. The journey back to the ranch took 5 days. They traveled with Curtis and Garrett, who'd stayed in the capital for the verdict and now seemed determined to celebrate the entire way home. Curtis told increasingly unlikely stories about his youth. Garrett complained about his arm, which had healed but apparently still hurt when convenient. The easy banter was a relief after weeks of tension. They stopped at several of the family's properties along the way, delivering news personally. The Chens cried. Reeves shook Seraphine's hand so hard Cade thought he'd break it. Mrs. Delgado hugged her and refused to let go until Seraphine hugged back. At each stop, the families asked what they owed her. Seraphine said nothing. They insisted on something. Finally, she told them to help the next person they saw struggling, and that would be payment enough. You're terrible at accepting gratitude, Cade observed after the third stop. I don't need gratitude. I needed them to get their land back. They did. That's enough. Is it? It has to be. The ranch appeared on the horizon on a clear afternoon, looking exactly as they'd left it, except somehow smaller, more manageable. Dutch was waiting in the yard, and to everyone's surprise, he smiled when he saw them. Heard you won, he said, helping Seraphine dismount. Figured you would. You're too stubborn to lose. I had help. Sure, but you started it. That's what matters. The crew had prepared dinner. Nothing fancy, just the usual ranch cooking, but with extra portions and a cake Curtis had apparently insisted on. They ate in the main house, talking and laughing, celebrating not just the legal victory, but the simple fact that everyone had survived. Cade watched Seraphine relax into the celebration, saw her shoulders gradually loosen, heard her laugh without the edge of tension that had characterized every sound she'd made for months. By the end of the night, she looked more at peace than he'd ever seen her. Later, after everyone had drifted off to bed, Cade found her in the barn with the black gelding. The horse was nuzzling her shoulder while she ran her hands over his neck. He did miss you, Cade said from the doorway. Or he's just hoping I have food. Could be both, Seraphine smiled. Thank you. For everything. For believing me when nobody else would. For standing with me when it was dangerous and stupid. For not giving up even when I wanted to. You never wanted to give up. I did. Multiple times. I just never admitted it out loud. Cade moved closer. What you did matters, Seraphine. Not just for those 17 families, but for everyone who heard about it. You proved that fighting back is possible, that powerful people aren't invincible. That's going to ripple out in ways you can't predict. You think so? I know so. I saw people in that courtroom. They weren't just watching a trial. They were watching someone refuse to accept that might makes right. That changes things. She was quiet for a moment, stroking the gelding's mane. Do you believe people are basically good or basically bad? Neither.
I think people are basically scared, like you said before. But I also think some people figure out how to be brave anyway. You're one of those. I didn't feel brave. I felt terrified the entire time. That's what brave is, being terrified and doing it anyway.
Seraphine turned to face him fully. I think I'd like to stay here, at the ranch. If the offer's still open. It is. Always was. Not as someone earning their place or proving anything, just as someone who wants to work with horses and fix fences and not fight for a while. That works. And maybe eventually as something more than just a ranch hand who answered a challenge. Cade's heart did something complicated in his chest. What kind of more? The kind we figure out together, without timelines or pressure, just seeing where things go.
I'd like that.
She stepped closer, and Cade found himself holding his breath. Then she reached up and kissed him, gentle and tentative and full of promise for things they'd finally have time to explore. When they pulled apart, Seraphine was smiling. Fair warning, I'm probably terrible at normal relationships. I don't know how to be when I'm not fighting something.
Then we'll figure it out together. That seems to be what we're good at. Figuring things out. That. And being too stubborn to quit even when we should. They stayed in the barn until the gelding got bored and wandered to the other side of his stall looking for hay. Then they walked back toward the house together, neither speaking, but both understanding that something fundamental had shifted between them.
The next morning, Cade woke to find Seraphine already working in the corral with the horses. She moved with easy competence, no longer looking over her shoulder for threats, no longer carrying the weight of a mission that consumed everything else. Dutch appeared beside Cade, watching her work. She staying? Looks like it. Good. Ranch feels more right with her here. Yeah, it does. You gonna marry her? Cade shot him a look. That's a jump.
Is it? You spent months fighting beside her, nearly died with her, stood with her against men who wanted her dead. Seems like marriage is a natural next step. We're figuring things out. That's code for yes, but you're both too stubborn to admit it quickly. You're impossible. And you're in love. But we both knew that already.
Dutch walked away before Cade could argue, leaving him standing there realizing the foreman was probably right. Somewhere between the standoff with Whitmore's riders and the trial and the journey back, watching Seraphine refuse to break no matter what was thrown at her, Cade had fallen completely and irrevocably in love. The question was what to do about it. The answer came 3 months later, on a cold morning when the ranch was covered in frost and the work had settled into comfortable routine. Seraphine had integrated completely into the crew, worked harder than anyone without the desperate edge she'd carried before, and spent evenings teaching Cade how to play the harmonica badly while they sat on the porch watching the frontier. That particular morning, Cade found her in the barn doing morning chores. Got a question for you, he said. Just one? You usually have at least 3. This one's important. Something in his tone made her pause. All right, what's the question? When I posted that challenge, looking for someone strong enough to build a ranch with me instead of just living on one, I thought I knew what I needed. And I was an idiot. I didn't need someone strong enough to build a ranch. I needed someone who'd remind me what was worth building in the first place. Someone who'd fight for what mattered even when the odds were impossible. Someone who'd stand with me, not just when it was easy, but especially when it was hard. Seraphine set down the pitchfork she'd been holding. Cade, boix, desoit. I'm not good at speeches, but I'm good at meaning what I say. So here it is. I love you. Have for a while now. And if you're willing, I'd like to marry you. Not because of some challenge or because we survived things together, but because building a life with you sounds better than building anything else. She stared at him, eyes wide. That's the question? Yes. Will you marry me? That's possibly the worst proposal I've ever heard. It's the only one I've got. It's terrible. No romance, no planning, just you standing in a barn asking like you're discussing fence repairs. So is that a no? Seraphine laughed, and the sound was full of joy and exasperation and love. It's a yes, you impossible man. Of course it's a yes. Cade pulled her into his arms, kissing her properly while the horses stamped and Dutch probably watched from somewhere nearby making commentary they'd hear about later. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Seraphine was grinning. We're going to be terrible at this, she said. Being married, being normal, Not fighting something. Probably. But at least we'll be terrible at it together. That's not reassuring. It's realistic. There's that word again. They went back to work after that, because the ranch didn't stop needing care just because life-changing questions had been asked and answered. But something had shifted. The future that had seemed uncertain and temporary now felt solid and permanent in the best possible way. The wedding happened 6 weeks later, small and simple in the ranch yard, with the crew and the families they'd helped standing witness. Seraphine wore the same borrowed formal clothes from the trial, and Cade wore his best shirt that Dutch had insisted he iron. Brennan officiated, having gotten ordained specifically for this purpose because Seraphine trusted him, and they wanted someone who understood what they'd been through. The vows were short. Cade promised to stand with her through whatever came next. Seraphine promised the same. Neither mentioned love or forever or the traditional words, just the practical commitment to face life together with the same stubborn determination that had carried them this far. When Brennan pronounced them married, Curtis whistled loudly, and Garrett yelled something inappropriate that made everyone laugh. They celebrated with barbecue and music, Seraphine playing her harmonica while others danced, the frontier stretching endlessly beyond the ranch like a promise of possibility. Later that night, after everyone had drifted off and the ranch had settled into quiet, Cade and Seraphine sat on the porch watching stars appear. "Think we'll be happy?" Seraphine asked. "I think we'll be us. Happy's just part of that. What's the rest? Stubborn, difficult, occasionally impossible, but always together." She leaned against him, and Cade wrapped his arm around her shoulders. Somewhere in the darkness, the black gelding whinnied. A coyote called from the hills. The frontier breathed around them, indifferent and eternal. "You know what I learned through all of this?" Seraphine said quietly. "What?" "That fighting for things isn't about winning completely. It's about refusing to accept that losing is inevitable. My father fought and died. Those families fought and almost lost everything. I fought and nearly destroyed myself. But we all refuse to just accept that powerful people get to crush everyone else. And that refusal matters, even when the victories are partial." That's pretty philosophical for someone who claims not to be philosophical. "I'm married now. I'm allowed to be philosophical occasionally. That's not how marriage works." "Then teach me how it works." "I have no idea. We'll figure it out as we go." That seems to be our approach to everything. It's worked so far. They sat until the stars were thick overhead and the temperature dropped enough that going inside seemed sensible. As they stood to leave, Seraphine paused. "Cade?" "Yeah? Thank you for seeing me. Not who I was pretending to be or who I thought I needed to be. Just me. That's all I ever saw. I know. That's why I love you." They went inside together, closing the door on the frontier night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Ranches didn't run themselves, and life never stopped presenting problems. But for tonight, they had each other and a home they'd fought to protect, and the quiet certainty that whatever came next, they'd face it the way they'd faced everything else. Together. Stubborn. Refusing to quit even when common sense suggested they should. And in the end, that was enough. Not perfect, not smooth, just real and solid and true. The kind of foundation you could build a life on, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one shared sunrise at a time. The ranch stood through that winter and many after. Cade and Seraphine worked it together, arguing about horses and fence placement and whether Curtis's coffee was actually getting worse or they'd just gotten used to it. They fought sometimes, made up always, and slowly built something that looked like the life neither had dared hope for back when she'd first ridden out of the dust with secrets and determination. The 17 families rebuilt on their reclaimed land. Some succeeded, some struggled. All knew who to thank when things went right, and all knew they had people willing to stand with them if things went wrong again. Whitmore went to prison. His operation collapsed. The officials he'd bribed were prosecuted. The system he'd corrupted was cleaned up, at least partially, at least for a while. And Seraphine Vale, who'd started as a fugitive with stolen documents and desperate hope, became something more important than a hero or a crusader. She became someone who'd proven that ordinary people could fight powerful corruption and sometimes, if they were stubborn enough and brave enough and lucky enough, actually win. That legacy rippled outward. Other families found courage to fight back against their own oppressors. Other young women learned that challenging the system wasn't futile. Other communities realized that change was possible if someone cared enough to start it. Not every story ended happily. Not every fight was won. But the possibility existed now where it hadn't before. And that possibility changed everything. Years later, when their children asked how their parents met, Cade would smile and say their mother had answered a challenge. Seraphine would correct him and say she'd been running from a fight when she'd accidentally found a better one. Both versions were true. Both missed important parts. The real story was simpler and more complicated than either summary could capture. Two people found each other in the middle of a war against corruption and discovered that fighting together was better than fighting alone. They won some things, lost others, built a life from the wreckage of their separate pasts. And in doing so, they proved that the frontier wasn't just about survival or conquest or taming wilderness. It was about creating home in inhospitable places, about standing for principles when standing cost everything, about refusing to let fear or power or impossible odds determine who got to live with dignity and who got crushed. That lesson outlasted everything else. Long after the specific details of land fraud and courtroom drama faded from immediate memory, people remembered the woman who refused to accept injustice and the man who stood with her because it was right. They became a story people told when they needed reminding that fighting back was possible. And sometimes, late at night when Cade and Seraphine sat on their porch watching the endless frontier, they'd look at each other and marvel at how something that started with desperation and theft and barely contained terror had transformed into this: a life built together, a home worth defending, a partnership that proved love and justice weren't separate aspirations, but two parts of the same essential truth: that some things were worth fighting for, that fighting didn't always mean winning completely, and that sometimes, if you were stubborn enough to refuse defeat, even when it seemed inevitable, you could change not just your own story, but everyone else's too. The frontier was hard and beautiful and unforgiving, but it was also full of people trying to build something better than what they'd left behind. Some succeeded alone. Some failed despite their best efforts. And some found partners who understood that the greatest victories weren't the ones you achieved by yourself, but the ones you fought for together, refusing to quit until everyone you cared about had a chance at the life they deserved. Cade and Seraphine were among the latter. And in being so, they became more than survivors or victors. They became proof that love and justice could coexist, that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things, that the frontier could be shaped not just by those with power and money, but by those with courage and conviction, and the stubborn refusal to accept that wrong would always triumph over right. Their story ended not with fanfare, but with daily choices to keep building, keep fighting, keep standing together against whatever came next. And that, more than any courtroom victory or dramatic confrontation, was the legacy that mattered most. Because in the end, life wasn't about grand gestures or perfect resolutions. It was about showing up every day and choosing to fight for what mattered, even when you were tired, even when the odds were terrible, even when victory seemed impossible. It was about refusing to quit. And it was about finding someone who refused right along with you, turning two separate struggles into one shared journey toward something better. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything.